good evening, and welcome to The Gentle Scientist. Tonight, we journey together to the very beginning of our story. Not the beginning of the universe, vast and distant though that is, but something more intimate. Tonight, we ask, why did humans evolve in Africa? It's a question that connects every person alive. Wherever you are listening from, your story begins there. In the red earth, in the volcanic highlands, in the grasslands stretching to every horizon. Africa is not just humanity's birthplace. It is the forge where we were shaped, the classroom where we learned, the crucible where everything that makes us human was slowly, patiently tested and refined across millions of years. This is not a story of sudden transformation, of dramatic leaps from ape to human in a single moment. Evolution works more quietly than that, more subtly. It is a story of small changes accumulating across incomprehensible spans of time, of landscapes shifting, climates oscillating, forests retreating, grasslands expanding, of populations adapting not just once, but constantly, endlessly, to conditions that never stopped changing. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. We have a long journey ahead, measured not in hours, but in millions of years, not in kilometers, but in the transformation of one kind of creature into another. Let the quiet exploration begin. Let us travel back, together, to where it all started, to Africa, to the place where humanity was born. Beneath the East African sun, in landscapes of red earth and scattered acacia, lie the fossils of our ancestors. Buried in sediment, compressed by time, transformed into stone, they wait in the darkness for millions of years until erosion or a fortunate excavation brings them once more into the light. They are the only physical evidence we have of those who came before, the tangible proof that the human story is written not just in myth and memory, but in fossil and stone. The story of finding these fossils is itself remarkable, a tale of patience, intuition, and occasionally extraordinary luck. For decades, scientists searched, guided by the understanding that if humans evolved in Africa, the evidence should be there, waiting to be found. But finding a fossil is like searching for a single page torn from a book and scattered across a landscape the size of a continent. The odds seem impossible, yet they found them. One by one, fragmentary at first, then more complete, a picture began to emerge from the African earth. Each discovery rewrote what we knew, pushed back the timeline, revealed unexpected branches in the family tree, showed that human evolution was not a simple ladder, but a tangled bush with many stems, most of which led nowhere, but one of which led to us. The first African hominin fossil to gain scientific attention was found not by a trained scientist, but by workers in a limestone quarry. In 1924, in Tong, South Africa, quarry workers blasted away rock and uncovered a small skull embedded in the stone. The skull made its way to Raymond Dart, an anatomist at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Dart studied the skull and realized he was looking at something extraordinary. A child, perhaps 3 years old when it died, with a mix of ape-like and human-like features. The Tong child, as it became known, had a small brain, about the size of a chimpanzee's, but the position where the spine met the skull, the foramen magnum, was oriented downward as in humans, suggesting upright posture. The teeth, though small and not yet fully grown, had more human-like proportions than ape teeth. Dart named this creature Australopithecus africanus, southern ape of Africa. He proposed it was an intermediate form between apes and humans. The scientific establishment of the time, centered in Europe, was skeptical. How could human ancestors come from Africa? Many believed humans had evolved in Asia or Europe, but Dart was correct. The Tong child was an Australopithecine, one of our early bipedal ancestors, dating to roughly 2.8 million years ago. It would take decades and many more discoveries before Dart was fully vindicated. The next major chapter in African fossil discoveries was written by the Leakey family, whose work in East Africa would transform our understanding of human origins. Louis Leakey, a Kenyan-born paleoanthropologist, was convinced that the Great Rift Valley held the key to human evolution. In 1959, he and his wife, Mary, were working at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, a site where erosion had exposed layers of sediment dating back nearly 2 million years. Mary Leakey made the discovery. While Louis was back at camp recovering from illness, Mary spotted bone fragments protruding from the ground. She carefully excavated what proved to be a skull, remarkably complete, with massive teeth and powerful jaw muscles. The Leakeys named it Zinjanthropus boisei, though it would later be reclassified as Paranthropus boisei. Zinj, as it was nicknamed, dated to 1.75 million years ago. Zinj was not a direct human ancestor, but a side branch, a specialized hominin adapted for processing tough plant materials with its enormous molars. But its discovery brought funding and attention to African paleoanthropology. Over the following years, the Leakeys and their teams found numerous other fossils at Olduvai, including remains of early Homo, our own genus, dating back to 2 million years or more. Then came Lucy. In 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johansen was working at Hadar in Ethiopia when team member Tom Gray spotted a bone fragment on the ground. As they searched the area, they found more bones: a thigh bone, ribs, vertebrae, a pelvis. The pieces came from a single individual, a small female who had died 3.2 million years ago. That evening, as the team celebrated, someone played the Beatles' song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" on a tape recorder, and the fossil acquired her nickname. Lucy was Australopithecus afarensis, a bipedal hominin standing about 1.1 meters tall. About 40% of her skeleton was recovered, an extraordinary amount for a fossil of such age. Her pelvis and leg bones showed clear adaptations for upright walking, yet her arms were relatively long and her fingers slightly curved, suggesting she still spent significant time in trees. She was a transitional form, caught between the arboreal life of earlier primates and the fully terrestrial existence of later humans. Lucy captured public imagination in a way few fossils had. She seemed relatable, a small individual whose bones told a story of life and death millions of years ago. Scientists could determine she was female from her pelvis size, young adult from her teeth, and that she had walked upright from her skeleton's architecture. Here was not just a species, but an individual, someone who had lived and breathed and moved through the Ethiopian landscape, leaving only bones as evidence of her existence. The discoveries continued. In 2000, Sarasane Alemseged began excavating at Dakika, Ethiopia, just across a river from where Lucy had been found. In 2006, his team announced an extraordinary find, a nearly complete skeleton of a 3-year-old Australopithecus afarensis child who had died 3.3 million years ago. Nicknamed Selam, meaning peace in several Ethiopian languages, the skeleton included the skull, much of the torso, and limbs. Even more remarkably, the hyoid bone from the throat was preserved, a rare find that provides clues about vocalization capabilities. At Olduvai Gorge, the Leakey's son Richard continued his parents' work, making significant discoveries in the region around Lake Turkana in Kenya. The most famous was the Turkana boy, discovered in 1984. This Homo erectus skeleton dated to 1.6 million years ago and was about 80% complete, one of the most complete early human skeletons ever found. The boy was perhaps 8-11 years old when he died, but already stood about 1.6 meters tall. Studying his skeleton provided insights into Homo erectus growth patterns, body proportions, and capabilities. More recently, spectacular discoveries have continued to emerge from African soil. In 2013, Lee Berger led an expedition into the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, where narrow passages opened into a chamber littered with hominin bones. Over 1,500 bone fragments were recovered, representing at least 15 individuals of a previously unknown species, Homo naledi. Naledi showed a puzzling mix of primitive and modern features. Its brain was small, about the size of an orange, similar to Australopithecines. Its hands and feet showed both climbing adaptations and features suited for tool use and walking. Initially, scientists thought it must be very ancient, but when the dating results came back, they were shocked. Between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. This meant Naledi existed at the same time as early Homo sapiens, suggesting greater diversity in the human family tree than previously imagined. Each of these fossils represents a small miracle of preservation. For bone to fossilize requires specific conditions. Rapid burial before scavengers or weather can destroy the remains. Sediments with the right chemical properties to replace bone mineral with stone, and then millions of years of protection from geological forces that might crush or disperse the fossils. The vast majority of individuals who lived left no trace. We are seeing only the tiniest fraction of the populations that once existed. The Great Rift Valley provides ideal conditions for fossil preservation. Volcanic eruptions regularly covered the landscape with ash, creating datable layers and sometimes burying remains quickly. Lakes and rivers deposited sediments that protected bones. The ongoing tectonic activity that created the rift also ensured that erosion would eventually expose ancient layers, bringing fossils back to the surface. Dating these fossils requires multiple techniques. Volcanic ash layers can be dated using radiometric methods, measuring the decay of radioactive isotopes like potassium-40 to argon-40. These provide absolute dates for the ash layers, and fossils found between two dated ash layers can be confidently placed in that time range. Other methods, like paleomagnetic dating, that measures ancient magnetic field reversals, and fauna, dating that compares associated animal species with those from other dated sites, provide additional chronological constraints. The fossils reveal not just what our ancestors looked like, but how they lived. Cut marks on animal bones found near stone tools show evidence of meat processing. Tooth wear patterns indicate diet, with some species showing adaptations for tough, gritty plant foods, while others had more generalized diets. Healed fractures reveal that individuals survived injuries, possibly cared for by group members. Pathologies show that ancient hominins suffered from diseases and conditions still familiar today. The geographic distribution of fossils also tells a story. East Africa, particularly the Rift Valley region, has produced the majority of early hominin fossils, supporting the idea that this region was particularly important in human evolution. South African cave sites have also yielded numerous crucial fossils, but significant gaps remain in the record from Central and West Africa, not necessarily because hominins weren't there, but because geological conditions in those regions are less favorable for fossil preservation. New discoveries continue to fill in the picture and complicate it in equal measure. In 2019, researchers announced fossils from Ledi Geraru, Ethiopia, dating to 2.8 million years ago, representing possibly the earliest known member of genus Homo. In 2015, 3.3 million-year-old stone tools were found at Lomekwe, Kenya, predating the earliest known Homo and suggesting that Australopithecines were already toolmakers. Each fossil site in Africa is like a window opening onto a specific moment in deep time. Olduvai Gorge shows us life as it was 1.8 million years ago. Hadar reveals conditions 3.2 million years past. Jebel Irhoud in Morocco provides glimpses of early Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago. Together, these windows create a panorama of human evolution, though with many dark gaps where no windows yet exist. The Earth holds more fossils still, waiting to be found. Every year brings new discoveries, new species, new dates that push back our timeline or reveal unexpected branches in the family tree. Additionally, inside every cell of your body, coiled and compact, lies a library more ancient than any written text. Your DNA, that elegant double helix of nucleotides, contains not just the instructions for building you, but a historical record stretching back through countless generations. It is a molecular archive, a genetic memory of every ancestor who contributed to your existence, every migration they undertook, every population bottleneck they survived. And when scientists learned to read this archive, it told a story that confirmed what the fossils had suggested. We all come from Africa. The genetic revolution in understanding human origins began in the 1980s, when researchers realized that DNA itself could serve as a record of evolutionary history. Mutations accumulate in DNA at relatively predictable rates, like a molecular clock ticking through the generations. By comparing DNA sequences between different individuals and populations, scientists could estimate how long ago those populations shared a common ancestor. The first breakthrough came from studying mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Mitochondria are the energy-producing structures inside cells, and they have their own small genome, separate from the main chromosomes in the cell's nucleus. Remarkably, mitochondria are inherited only from mothers. When an egg is fertilized, the sperm's mitochondria don't enter the egg, so every person's mtDNA comes entirely from their mother, who got it from her mother, who got it from hers, in an unbroken maternal line stretching back through time. In 1987, a team led by Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson published a landmark study analyzing mtDNA from 147 people, representing diverse populations from around the world. They constructed a family tree showing how all these mtDNA sequences related to each other. The results were striking. The deepest branches, the oldest lineages, were all found in African populations. Non-African populations showed less diversity and clustered on more recent branches. The interpretation was clear. All modern human mtDNA descended from a common female ancestor who lived in Africa. The researchers estimated this woman lived around 200,000 years ago, based on the amount of genetic divergence that had accumulated since. The media dubbed her Mitochondrial Eve, though this name is somewhat misleading. She was not the only woman alive at the time, not the first human, not even necessarily special in any way, except that her maternal lineage happened to be the one that survived to the present. Imagine a population with many women. Each has mitochondrial DNA that she passes to her children. Over time, some lineages die out. A woman has no children, or only sons, or her daughters have only sons. Generation by generation, maternal lineages are lost by chance. Eventually, if you trace back far enough, all surviving lineages converge on a single ancestral woman. This is Mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common ancestor of all living humans through the maternal line. Her existence doesn't mean there was a genetic bottleneck or that the population was small at that time. There were many other women alive, but their maternal lineages eventually died out. It's a consequence of how inheritance works, not evidence of near extinction. What matters for understanding human origins is not Eve herself, but where she lived and when. And the genetic evidence placed her in Africa, roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, consistent with the fossil evidence for the emergence of Homo sapiens. Scientists then turned to Y chromosome DNA, which traces paternal lineages since the Y chromosome is passed from fathers to sons. Studies of Y chromosome diversity revealed a similar pattern. The deepest branches and greatest diversity in African populations, with non-African populations showing less diversity and more recent origins. The most recent common ancestor through the paternal line, sometimes called Y chromosomal Adam, lived somewhat earlier than mitochondrial Eve, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, though the exact timing remains debated. Again, this doesn't mean Adam and Eve knew each other. They likely lived thousands of years apart and in different regions of Africa. They are simply the individuals whose maternal and paternal lineages happen to be the ones that survived to contribute to all living humans. There were many other men and women alive at those times, many of whom also contributed to the modern human gene pool through other genetic pathways, but whose mtDNA or Y chromosome lineages were lost through chance. As genetic technology advanced, Scientists began analyzing the entire nuclear genome, not just mitochondrial or Y chromosome DNA. Nuclear DNA comes from both parents and recombines in each generation, making analysis more complex, but also providing vastly more information. Whole genome studies confirmed and refined the picture painted by mtDNA and Y chromosome studies. African populations show the highest genetic diversity of any populations on Earth. This makes sense if humans originated in Africa and spent most of their evolutionary history there. Populations accumulate diversity through mutations over time, and African populations have had the longest time to accumulate mutations. Non-African populations descended from a small group that left Africa relatively recently, carrying only a subset of African genetic diversity. This founding population effect left a permanent signature in the genomes of everyone whose ancestors lived outside Africa. The pattern is visible at thousands of locations across the genome. Single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, are positions where DNA sequences vary between individuals. African populations have more SNPs, more genetic variants at more locations than non-African populations. When researchers plot genetic distances between populations, African groups are most different from each other, while non-African groups cluster more tightly together, like branches that split off relatively recently from a single stem. These studies also revealed something unexpected. Non-African populations carry small amounts of DNA from other hominin species. When modern humans left Africa and spread across Eurasia, they encountered Neanderthals, who had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. The two groups interbred, and as a result, people of European and Asian ancestry today carry roughly 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some Asian and Oceanian populations also carry DNA from Denisovans, another archaic human group known primarily from genetic evidence, and a few fossils from Siberia. Crucially, African populations generally lack these archaic human contributions, or have them only in tiny amounts from much later back migration. This provides powerful evidence that modern humans originated in Africa and only encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans after leaving the continent. If humans had evolved in Eurasia, or if different regional populations had evolved independently from local archaic humans, the genetic patterns would look completely different. Instead, the data consistently shows that modern humans arose in Africa and then spread outward, mixing with other hominins along the way. The genetic data also allows reconstruction of population history with remarkable detail. Scientists can estimate population sizes through time by analyzing patterns of genetic diversity. More diversity suggests larger populations with many mating pairs contributing to the gene pool. Less diversity suggests smaller populations or recent bottlenecks when population size crashed. These studies reveal that human populations in Africa went through several bottlenecks, periods when numbers dropped significantly. One severe bottleneck occurred around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, possibly corresponding to harsh climate conditions or environmental disasters. The effective population size, the number of breeding individuals, may have dropped to as low as 10,000 or even fewer. This bottleneck left a signature of reduced genetic diversity that persists today. Interestingly, the founding population that left Africa appears to have been even smaller, perhaps just 1,000 to 10,000 individuals. This founding event created another bottleneck, further reducing genetic diversity in non-African populations. As these immigrants spread across the world, some groups experienced additional founder effects. Native American populations show reduced diversity compared to Asian populations, consistent with a small founding group crossing into the Americas. Pacific Islander populations show similar patterns of reduced diversity from serial founder effects as people island hopped across the Pacific. The molecular clock calibrated from these genetic studies allows estimation of when key events occurred. The split between African populations and the ancestors of all non-African populations happened around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, consistent with archaeological evidence of the out-of-Africa migration. The diversification of non-African populations as groups split and spread across Eurasia happened between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. The peopling of the Americas began around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, and the settlement of the Pacific Islands occurred within the last few thousand years. Modern ancient DNA technology has added another dimension to this story. By extracting and sequencing DNA from fossils, scientists can directly read the genomes of ancient individuals and compare them to modern populations. Ancient DNA from African fossils is scarce because DNA degrades rapidly in warm, humid conditions, but some samples have been successfully analyzed. DNA from a 15,000-year-old skeleton in Morocco showed genetic continuity with modern North African populations, but also genetic links to sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, revealing complex patterns of migration and mixing within Africa. DNA from ancient hunter-gatherers in southern and eastern Africa has revealed that modern African populations are not simply descendants of a static ancient population, but reflect multiple migrations and mixtures within the continent over thousands of years. These genetic discoveries have profound implications. They demonstrate conclusively that race, as traditionally conceived, has no biological basis. The genetic variation between any two individuals within a population is typically greater than the average variation between populations. What we perceive as racial differences, skin color, facial features, hair texture, are superficial traits governed by a tiny fraction of our genome, adaptations to local environments that evolved recently in human history. All humans share a common African heritage, visible in our DNA. The genetic differences that exist between populations are mostly the result of geographic isolation, genetic drift, and local adaptation to different environments after humans spread across the world. These differences are shallow, recent, and quantitatively minor compared to the deep genetic unity linking all humans. The DNA evidence also confirms that the human family tree is not a simple ladder, but a tangled bush. Multiple hominin species coexisted in Africa, and modern humans emerged not from a single ancestral species, but from a complex web of populations that were somewhat isolated but occasionally mixed. Recent genetic studies suggest that our ancestry includes contributions from multiple African populations, some of which were quite divergent from each other. This complexity makes sense in the context of Africa's size and environmental diversity. Different populations adapted to different regions, forests, savannas, coasts, highlands, and became genetically distinctive, but they maintained enough contact to exchange genes occasionally, preventing complete speciation while allowing regional differentiation. This structured population model, rather than a single panmictic population or complete isolation, appears to best fit the genetic data. The genetic evidence supports and extends what the fossils tell us. Where fossils provide direct evidence of what ancient individuals looked like and where they lived, DNA provides information about population relationships, migrations, mixing events, and demographic history. Together, fossils and genes create a comprehensive picture of human origins. The library written in your cells preserves this memory, a testament to the common origin of all humanity. The DNA doesn't lie. It cannot lie. It simply records, with molecular precision, the history of where we have been and what we have endured. And that history begins, always, in Africa. But why did humans evolve in Africa? There are moments in the history of life when conditions align in ways that make the impossible inevitable. When the right ingredients, the right environment, the right timing converge to create something that could not have happened any other way, anywhere else. The evolution of complex, intelligent, technological humanity was one such moment. And it happened in Africa not by accident, but because only Africa provided the precise combination of factors necessary to forge such a species. Let us consider what was required. To evolve humans, you need a starting point. Primates with grasping hands, binocular vision, and social complexity. You need environmental pressure sufficient to drive evolutionary change, but not so extreme as to cause extinction. You need enough geographic space to support viable populations through climate crises. You need diverse environments to select for behavioral flexibility rather than narrow specialization. You need time, millions of years, for small changes to accumulate into profound transformation. And you need all of these factors to persist simultaneously across geological timescales. Only Africa provided them all. Begin with geography. Africa's position, straddling the equator and extending from temperate Mediterranean climates to near Antarctic southern latitudes, creates unmatched environmental diversity within a single continental landmass. This matters because evolution proceeds differently in uniform versus varied environments. In stable, uniform conditions, species can become exquisitely adapted to specific niches. But such specialization is fragile. When conditions change, specialists often perish. In variable, diverse environments, natural selection favors different traits. Behavioral flexibility, learning ability, generalist dietary strategies, physiological tolerance for changing conditions. These are precisely the traits that define humanity. We are not the strongest primates, nor the fastest, nor the most specialized for any particular food source or habitat, but we are the most adaptable, able to modify our behavior to suit circumstances rather than depending on fixed instincts. Africa's diversity operated at multiple spatial scales. At the continental level, vast regions differed dramatically. dense rainforests in the Congo, open savannas in East Africa, deserts in the north and southwest, Mediterranean ecosystems along the coasts, highland regions with temperate climates. A species expanding its range across Africa would encounter all of these, learning to extract resources from each, developing behavioral repertoires flexible enough to succeed in forests, grasslands, deserts, and coasts. At regional scales, the mosaic nature of African environments created patchwork landscapes where different habitat types existed in close proximity. This is particularly evident in East Africa, where the topography created by rifting produced steep environmental gradients. You could move from dense riverine forest to open grassland within a few kilometers, from hot lowlands to cool highlands within a day's walk. Species living in such mosaics faced constant variation, selecting for individuals who could navigate and exploit multiple environments rather than specializing in one. The climate variability we discussed later amplified this diversity across time. Africa's environments weren't static. The forests expanded during wet phases, retreated during dry phases. Grasslands appeared where forests had been. Then forests returned. This temporal variability meant that no single adaptive strategy remained optimal for long. Flexibility itself became the adaptation, the ability to adjust behavior as conditions changed. This combination of spatial and temporal variability created an evolutionary environment that selected powerfully for intelligence, for learning capacity, for the ability to solve novel problems and transmit solutions culturally. A species that could observe patterns, remember solutions, communicate them to others, and modify traditions as needed would have enormous advantages over species relying solely on instinctive behaviors. The Rift Valley's role was particularly crucial. By creating barriers that partially isolated populations while allowing occasional gene flow, the rift facilitated the kind of structured evolution that appears to have characterized human origins. Populations could diverge in isolation, developing unique adaptations, then occasionally mix, allowing successful innovations to spread while maintaining overall species coherence. This balance between isolation and connection may have been key to the emergence of modern humans from a complex network of African populations. Africa's geological stability also mattered. While tectonic activity created the rift, the ancient cratons remained stable, providing continuous habitable zones throughout climatic fluctuations. Other continents experienced more dramatic restructuring. India crashed into Asia, raising the Himalayas and radically altering regional climates. Australia drifted into isolation, cutting its fauna off from evolutionary developments elsewhere. South America was isolated for millions of years before the Isthmus of Panama connected it to North America. Africa, by contrast, remained connected to Eurasia through the Middle East, allowing gene flow and preventing complete isolation while still maintaining distinct regional characteristics. The disease environment, though challenging, also played a role. Africa's warmth and moisture create ideal conditions for pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites. The disease burden faced by African populations was and is among the highest on Earth. This created intense selective pressure on immune systems, driving evolution of diverse and robust immune responses. When humans eventually left Africa, they carried this immune complexity with them, providing some protection against novel pathogens encountered elsewhere. The presence of large, intelligent, and dangerous predators created another selective pressure unique in its intensity. Africa's carnivore guild, lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, crocodiles, was diverse and formidable. These predators had co-evolved with hominins, learning to see them as potential prey. Unlike the naive predators humans would later encounter in other continents, African carnivores were sophisticated hunters, familiar with primate behavior. Surviving in this environment required constant vigilance, cooperation for defense, and development of strategies to minimize vulnerability. Humans learned to use fire to create safe zones, to post sentries while others slept or foraged, to read landscape features that might conceal predators, to interpret the alarm calls of other species that served as early warning systems. These anti-predator behaviors required communication, social coordination, and cognitive sophistication, precisely the skills that would later enable complex culture. The megafauna of Africa, both as resources and threats, also shaped human evolution. African elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and buffalo are among the largest and most dangerous land animals on Earth. Hunting them required technological innovation, cooperative strategies, and detailed knowledge of animal behavior. But African megafauna, having co-evolved with hominins, learned caution. They developed wariness of humans, defensive behaviors, and in some cases, aggressive responses to human presence. This differs dramatically from what happened when humans entered other continents. In the Americas, Australia, and various islands, megafauna had no evolutionary experience with human hunters. They showed little fear, making them easy targets. The result was often rapid extinction of naive species within a few thousand years of human arrival. But African megafauna, educated by millions of years of coexistence with tool-using hominins, survived. This survival both provided ongoing resources for human populations and maintained the selective pressure for sophisticated hunting strategies. The size of Africa itself was crucial. Large geographic areas support large populations, which maintain greater genetic diversity and are more resistant to extinction from local catastrophes. During climate downturns, some regions became uninhabitable, but others remained viable refugia, where populations could persist. The vastness of Africa meant that even during the worst climate crises, enough habitable space remained to prevent total collapse. Large populations also maintain cultural knowledge more effectively. Skills and innovations can be lost in small populations if key individuals die without passing on their knowledge. But in larger populations, multiple individuals know each technique, reducing the risk of knowledge loss. The demographic structure that Africa's size allowed provided a buffer against cultural regression during hard times. The tropical latitude meant year-round primary productivity. Unlike temperate regions where winter stops plant growth and reduces available calories, equatorial and subtropical Africa produces food year-round. This doesn't mean food was always abundant or easy to obtain, but it means some resources were available in every season. Combined with Africa's biodiversity, this created a complex of potential food sources that could sustain populations even when preferred resources failed. Africa's position at the crossroads of the Old World prevented complete isolation while allowing regional development. The continent connects to Eurasia through the Sinai Peninsula and at various times through Arabia when the sea levels dropped or climate improved. This connection allowed occasional gene flow and prevented the kind of isolated evolution that can lead to evolutionary dead ends. Yet Africa was large enough that populations within it could differentiate while still remaining part of a larger metapopulation. Consider counterfactuals. Could humans have evolved in South America? The continent has tropical forests and diverse environments, but it was isolated from other landmasses for most of the Cenozoic. The primates there evolved independently and never developed the same trajectory toward bipedalism and tool use. Could humans have evolved in Asia? Some hominin species, like Homo erectus, lived there for nearly 2 million years, but never developed the full suite of modern human characteristics. Europe? Too small, too temperate, lacking the environmental diversity and stability needed for the long evolutionary process. Even within Africa, the specific region mattered. East Africa, with its rift valleys, volcanic highlands, climate variability, and mosaic environments, appears to have been particularly important. The concentration of fossil sites in this region isn't just preservation bias. This area truly was a crucible of human evolution, providing the most intense combination of challenges and opportunities. The confluence of all these factors, environmental diversity, climate variability, geographic position, continental size, disease environment, predator community, megafauna presence, tropical productivity, and millions of years of continuous habitation created a unique evolutionary environment. No other continent, no other region provided this exact combination. It was not inevitable that intelligent technological life would evolve even in Africa. Evolution has no foresight, no goals. Many possible outcomes existed, but the conditions in Africa made the evolution of behavioral flexibility, learning capacity, and cultural transmission more likely than anywhere else on Earth. And once these traits began to evolve, they reinforced each other in feedback loops that accelerated the process. Tools enabled access to new foods. Better nutrition supported larger brains. Larger brains conceived better tools. Language facilitated cooperation and knowledge transmission. Cooperation enabled more sophisticated hunting and social organization. Social complexity selected for greater cognitive ability to navigate relationships. Each innovation built on previous innovations, the pace accelerating as the cognitive and cultural machinery became more sophisticated. By the time Homo sapiens emerged around 300,000 years ago, millions of years of evolution in Africa had created a species unlike any before. We were still tropical animals in our biology, hairless, poorly adapted to cold, without cultural modifications. Our physiology tuned to African conditions. But in our behavior, our cognition, our cultural capacity, we had become something unprecedented. A generalist specialist, a species adapted not to any particular environment, but to adaptation itself. Africa didn't just witness human evolution, it authored it, shaped it, perfected it across millions of years. Every challenge the continent presented became a lesson. Every crisis became a test. Every opportunity became a reward for flexibility and innovation. The continent served as both forge and teacher, smithing humanity through heat and pressure, teaching through experience repeated across thousands of generations. Now, let's take a closer look at the challenges Africa posed and why they made it the only place on Earth where this could have happened. Long before the first human voice whispered across a savanna, long before any primate stood upright beneath an African sky, the continent itself was already preparing. Africa is ancient beyond imagination. Not just old in the way mountains are old, but old in the way that speaks to the very bones of the earth itself. Beneath your feet, wherever you stand on this planet, lies rock with a story. But beneath Africa lies something extraordinary. The cratons, vast shields of primordial stone that form the hearts of continents, are among the oldest surfaces on Earth. The Kapval Craton in southern Africa solidified more than 3.5 billion years ago, when the planet was still young and the sky held no oxygen to breathe. The Tanzania Craton, the West African Craton, each one a testament to deep time, to a world before life as we know it. These ancient foundations are not just old, they are stable. While other continents buckled and folded, rose and fell, Africa remained remarkably still at its core. This stability matters more than you might imagine. For millions upon millions of years, while the supercontinent Pangaea gathered all land into one vast mass, Africa rested near its center. When that great landmass began to split apart around 200 million years ago, Africa barely moved. Picture it, continents drifting like slow ships across a molten sea. South America tearing away to the west, India racing northward toward Asia, Australia spinning off toward the southern seas, Antarctica sliding toward the frozen pole. But Africa stayed. It rotated slightly, shifted north by degrees, but essentially remained in place, straddling the equator like an anchor in the restless ocean of tectonic plates. This steadiness created something precious: continuity. While other lands experienced violent upheavals, dramatic climate swings, and wholesale restructuring, Africa maintained vast stretches of habitable terrain, forests that had millions of years to mature, river systems that carved their paths without interruption, soil that deepened and enriched itself through countless seasons. The Congo Basin, one of the oldest river systems on Earth, has flowed for tens of millions of years. The ancient rivers of southern Africa have carried sediment and life since before primates existed. This kind of geological patience creates ecosystems of staggering complexity, layer upon layer of life, adapting, diversifying, filling every possible niche. But Africa's story is not one of monotony. Stability does not mean stillness. Volcanic activity punctuated the landscape, particularly in the east. The African plate, though relatively stationary, churned with heat from below. Mantle plumes, columns of molten rock rising from deep within the earth, pushed upward against the crust. These plumes brought something invaluable: minerals. When volcanoes erupted across the African landscape, they did not just build mountains. They scattered nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, trace elements essential for life, all delivered in ash that fell like black snow across the savannas and forests. Soils born from volcanic parent material are among the most fertile on Earth. They support explosive growth, dense vegetation, abundant prey animals, and the predators that hunt them. The dance between fire and fertility played out over millions of years. Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, the Virunga volcanoes all rose from this deep heat, their slopes cloaked in rich soil that sustained forests where early primates would eventually shelter. Even today, the volcanic highlands of Ethiopia and Kenya support some of the densest human populations on the continent, their ancient fertility unchanged. Africa's position astride the equator meant something else as well: sunlight. Consistent, powerful, year-round sunlight that drove photosynthesis at rates unmatched in higher latitudes. Energy from the sun became energy in plants, in the animals that ate plants, in the predators that hunted those animals. A cascade of calories flowing through ecosystems that grew more complex with each passing millennium. The continent's sheer size matters too. Africa is vast, the second largest landmass on Earth, spanning from the Mediterranean coasts to the Cape of Good Hope, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. This vastness created room for populations to grow, to spread, to become isolated from one another and evolve in different directions. Room for experiments in survival. Within this single continent existed nearly every environment Earth had to offer. Tropical rainforests in the Congo, steaming and dense. Deserts in the Sahara and Kalahari, testing the limits of endurance. Mountains reaching high enough to touch snow at the equator. Vast lakes holding more fresh water than most countries possess. Grasslands stretching to every horizon. Coastal zones where land met sea in endless variation. This diversity was not accidental. Africa's geological foundations, its volcanic activity, its position relative to wind patterns and ocean currents, all conspired to create a continent of contrasts. And contrasts drive evolution. A species that can survive in the Congo's heat can adapt to the Ethiopian highlands' cold. A population that learns to find water in the Kalahari carries knowledge that will serve them anywhere. The stage was being set, slowly, patiently, across geological timescales that make human history seem like a single breath. Continents positioned themselves. Climates stabilized into patterns. Soils deepened. Rivers carved their channels. Forests grew and retreated and grew again in cycles timed to the Earth's orbital variations. By the time the first primates appeared in the fossil record, around 55 million years ago, Africa was ready. The ancient cratons provided stable ground. The tropical sun provided energy. The volcanic soils provided nutrients. The diverse environments provided endless opportunities for adaptation. Everything necessary for the slow work of evolution was in place. Beneath the surface of East Africa, something extraordinary was stirring. For millions of years, heat had been building deep within the mantle, rising in massive plumes toward the crust above. The pressure grew, patient and inexorable, until finally, around 25 million years ago, the continent began to tear itself apart. The Great Rift Valley is not a scar from some ancient wound. It is an active separation, a place where Africa is slowly splitting into two pieces. Stand at its edge today, and you are witnessing geology in motion. The same forces that once broke Pangaea into fragments, now working to divide Africa itself. The rift stretches more than 6,000 kilometers from the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia down through Kenya, Tanzania, and into Mozambique. In some places, the valley floor drops more than a kilometer below the surrounding highlands, a vast trench carved by the Earth's restless energy. This was not a sudden rupture. The rift opened gradually, millimeter by millimeter, century after century, millennium after millennium. But in geological terms, 25 million years is almost rapid. The process continues today, the African plate splitting along the East African rift at a rate of about 7 millimeters per year. In 10 million years, perhaps less, the rift may fill with seawater, creating a new ocean and making East Africa an island. But we are concerned with the past, with what this great tearing of the earth created. And what it created was nothing less than the birthplace of humanity. As the crust stretched and thinned, magma rose through the weakened rock. Volcanoes erupted along the length of the rift, building enormous mountains that still dominate the landscape. Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest peak, rose from this volcanic fury. Mount Kenya, Mount Meru, the Virunga volcanoes, all children of the rift, all born from the same deep heat that was pulling the continent apart. These eruptions did more than build mountains. They transformed the soil. Volcanic ash, rich in minerals, fell across vast areas, creating some of the most fertile ground on Earth. When rain dissolved these minerals, they became available to plants, which grew in extraordinary abundance. Those plants fed herbivores, which in turn fed carnivores, creating ecosystems of stunning productivity. The volcanic highlands became oases of life, green refuges in an increasingly variable landscape. The rift also created dramatic changes in elevation. The valley floor and the high plateaus on either side produced microclimates, small regions where temperature, rainfall, and vegetation differed significantly over short distances. On the western wall of the rift, forests might cling to the slopes, capturing moisture from prevailing winds. On the valley floor, grasslands and scattered trees. On the eastern wall, perhaps drier woodland or even semi-desert conditions. This variation matters profoundly. Evolution thrives on variation. When populations encounter different environments, they adapt in different ways. Natural selection favors different traits depending on local conditions. Over time, populations diverge, becoming distinct subspecies, then separate species entirely. The rift created countless opportunities for this divergence. Lakes formed in the deepest sections of the valley, fed by rivers draining the highlands. Lake Turkana in Kenya, Lake Tanganyika on the border of Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lake Malawi, further south. These are not ordinary lakes. Lake Tanganyika is the world's second deepest lake, holding more than 16% of the planet's available fresh water. Lake Malawi contains more fish species than any other lake on Earth, each one adapted to specific conditions within its waters. The lakes were not permanent fixtures. They expanded during wet periods, providing water and attracting animals for hundreds of kilometers. During dry periods, they shrank or vanished entirely, leaving behind mineral-rich sediments. These cycles of flooding and drying created what paleontologists call sediment traps, places where bones, tools, and other remains could be buried quickly, protected from scavengers and weather, and preserved for millions of years. This is why so many of our most important fossils come from the Rift Valley. The conditions were perfect for fossilization. Volcanic eruptions provided layers of datable ash. Rapid sedimentation buried remains before they could decay. The chemistry of the soil, influenced by volcanic minerals, helped preserve bone. And the rift's dramatic topography meant that erosion would eventually expose these ancient layers, allowing modern humans to discover them. But the rift did something even more important than preserve evidence. It created barriers. As the valley deepened and widened, it became difficult for animals to cross from one side to the other. Populations became isolated. A group of primates on the western side of the rift might live in dense forest, while their relatives on the eastern side adapted to more open woodland. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these populations would diverge. The eastern side of the rift experienced particularly dramatic changes. The presence of the high volcanic mountains blocked moisture-carrying winds from the west, creating a rain shadow effect. The eastern regions became progressively drier, the forests thinning into woodland, then woodland opening into savanna. This transformation would become crucial to human evolution, forcing our ancestors to adapt to a new kind of world. Within the rift itself, isolated populations could evolve in relative separation. A group living near Lake Turkana might rarely, if ever, encounter groups living near Lake Tanganyika, hundreds of kilometers to the south. Each population would adapt to its local conditions, developing unique strategies for survival. Some of these experiments in evolution would fail, those lineages vanishing without descendants. Others would persist, would thrive, would eventually give rise to something unprecedented. The volcanic activity brought another gift: obsidian. This naturally occurring volcanic glass forms when certain types of lava cool rapidly. It fractures with incredibly sharp edges, sharper than modern surgical steel. Our ancestors discovered that obsidian could be flaked into tools of remarkable precision. Archaeological sites throughout the Rift Valley contain obsidian tools. Some transported more than 100 kilometers from their source, evidence of trade networks or seasonal movements between resource-rich areas. The highlands created by the rifting also provided refuge during climate extremes. When the lowlands became unbearably hot or desperately dry, higher elevations offered cooler temperatures and more reliable rainfall. These mountains served as refugia, places where populations could survive during difficult periods, then expand back into the lowlands when conditions improved. The alternation between isolation and connection, between separation and mixing, created ideal conditions for evolutionary innovation. Populations would diverge in isolation, developing new traits. Then climate changes would alter the landscape, breaking down barriers, allowing different groups to meet, compete, and sometimes interbreed. Successful innovations could spread through populations. Less successful lineages would fade away. Modern genetic studies suggest that human evolution was not a simple linear progression from one species to the next. Instead, it was a tangled bush of different populations, sometimes isolated, sometimes mixing, with gene flow happening across groups that we might classify as separate species. The geography of the Rift Valley, with its mountains, lakes, and varied environments, perfectly facilitated this complex pattern. The sky above Africa began to change around 10 million years ago. Not suddenly, not in ways that any single generation of animals would notice, but slowly, inexorably, the climate was shifting. The world was cooling. Far to the north and south, ice was building at the poles, locking away water that had once circulated freely through the oceans and atmosphere. And Africa, straddling the equator, felt the effects ripple through its ecosystems like waves across still water. For millions of years, much of Africa had been draped in dense tropical forest. Trees stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior, their canopies forming a continuous green ceiling that filtered the sunlight into dappled shadows. In these forests, our distant ancestors lived as primates had always lived, moving through branches, feeding on fruits and leaves, their world vertical and enclosed. But the cooling planet was changing the patterns of rainfall. The great monsoon systems that had watered the African forests began to weaken and shift. The seasonal rains became less reliable. Dry periods grew longer. And gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the forests began to retreat. This was not a simple process of trees dying and disappearing. Climate change rarely works so directly. Instead, the forests fragmented, breaking into patches separated by more open terrain. Where once there had been continuous canopy, now there were clearings. Where once every tree had touched its neighbor, now gaps appeared, allowing sunlight to reach the ground. In these gaps, a different kind of vegetation took hold. Grasses, not the delicate forest floor grasses that grew in shade, but robust species adapted to full sunlight, seasonal drought, and periodic fires. These grasses had evolved in isolated pockets, waiting for their moment. When the forests retreated, that moment arrived. The expansion of grasslands across Africa was one of the most significant transformations in our planet's history. By around 5 million years ago, vast savannas stretched across the eastern and southern portions of the continent. These were not uniform plains. They were mosaics, complex landscapes where patches of forest remained, especially along rivers and in highland areas, interspersed with woodlands, bushlands, and open grasslands. This mosaic environment became the crucible of human evolution. Imagine it, a landscape neither fully forested nor completely open, but somewhere in between. Trees clustered near water sources, woodlands covered hillsides, grasslands spread across the flats. The terrain varied from kilometer to kilometer, creating countless different microhabitats, each with its own challenges and opportunities. The climate continued to oscillate. Africa's rainfall patterns are governed by complex interactions between ocean temperatures, wind systems, and the seasonal migration of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, where trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres meet. Small changes in these patterns could transform a region from well-watered to semi-arid in a matter of centuries. These oscillations occurred on multiple timescales. There were long-term trends, like the overall drying that peaked around 2.8 million years ago. There were cycles of tens of thousands of years, driven by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, the same Milankovitch cycles that trigger ice ages at higher latitudes. And there were shorter fluctuations, droughts lasting decades or centuries, followed by wetter periods. For the animals living through these changes, adaptability became paramount. Species that could only survive in dense forest faced shrinking habitats. Those that required specific rainfall patterns found their ranges shifting. But species that could tolerate variability, that could adjust their diets and behaviors to changing conditions, these were the ones that persisted. Our ancestors found themselves caught in this transition. The ancient forests that had sheltered their primate forebears were fragmenting. The new savannas offered opportunities, but also dangers. To understand what this meant, you must understand what savannas are. Savannas are not simply grasslands. They are dynamic ecosystems shaped by fire, grazing, and seasonal water availability. During the wet season, grasses grow explosively, sometimes reaching heights of 2 meters or more. This creates abundant food for herbivores, but it also creates fuel. When the dry season arrives and lightning strikes, or when humans eventually learn to create fire, the grasslands burn. These fires are not destructive in the way forest fires are. Savanna grasses are adapted to burning. Their growing points are at ground level, protected from flames. Their root systems run deep, storing energy underground. After a fire sweeps through, the grass regrows quickly, often within days if rain follows. Trees, however, struggle. Young trees burn easily. Only those species with thick, fire-resistant bark or the ability to resprout from roots can survive repeated burning. This creates the characteristic savanna landscape. Scattered trees, some standing alone, others in small groves, surrounded by grass. The trees that do survive are often acacias, baobabs, and other species with adaptations to fire and drought. Their presence provides crucial resources: shade, fruit, nesting sites for birds, and markers in an otherwise open landscape. The herbivores that grazed these savannas were unlike anything in the forests. Giant wildebeest, ancient elephants, three-toed horses, enormous pigs, and antelopes of every conceivable size roamed in herds that could number in the thousands. These herds followed the rains, moving seasonally between feeding grounds, their migrations creating highways across the landscape. And following the herbivores came predators: saber-toothed cats, hyenas, wild dogs, leopards, and early lions. The savanna was not safe. It was open, exposed, visible from every direction. An animal walking through the grass could be seen by predators from hundreds of meters away. This was a very different world from the forest, where danger lurked in the branches, but could often be avoided by staying alert and moving carefully. For a primate adapted to forest life, the savanna presented enormous challenges. In trees, safety was above. Threatened by a predator, climb higher. Food was often within arm's reach. Water pooled in tree hollows or dripped from leaves. But on the savanna, everything was different. Food was on the ground or in scattered trees that might be far apart. Water was concentrated in rivers, lakes, and seasonal pools. Safety required awareness, vigilance, and something new: the ability to see predators before they got close. This is where the mosaic nature of the environment becomes crucial. Our ancestors didn't abandon the trees completely and march boldly into open grassland. Instead, they lived at the interface, in the borderlands between forest and savanna. They could retreat to trees when threatened, but forage in more open areas when safe. They learned to read the landscape, to know which trees bore fruit when, where water could be found during dry seasons, which routes offered cover. The seasonal nature of the savanna also demanded new cognitive skills. In a tropical forest, food is available year-round, though specific fruits ripen at specific times. On the savanna, seasons are dramatic. The wet season brings abundance: green grass, swelling fruits, active prey animals. The dry season brings hardship: withered grass, dried water holes, scarce food. Surviving required memory, planning, and the ability to anticipate what would come next. There is evidence that early hominins tracked seasonal patterns. They knew when certain plants would fruit, when herds would migrate through particular areas, when rivers would run low and concentrate fish in pools. This knowledge required mental maps of large territories, time sense spanning months, and the ability to share information within social groups. The climate variability also meant that no single strategy guaranteed success. A diet that worked during wet periods might fail during droughts. Behaviors effective in dense woodland might be dangerous in open grassland. This variability selected for flexibility, for the ability to adjust, to experiment, to learn new skills. Scientists call this the variability selection hypothesis. Instead of adapting to a single, stable environment, our ancestors adapted to instability itself. They became generalists, capable of exploiting many different resources. They developed large brains that could process complex environmental information and generate novel solutions to novel problems. The fossil record shows this happening in real time. Around 3 million years ago, multiple hominin species coexisted in East Africa, each with slightly different adaptations. Some, like Paranthropus, developed massive jaws and teeth for processing tough plant materials. Others, like early Homo, maintained more flexible diets and began enlarging their brains. When climate swings intensified around 2.8 million years ago, the specialists struggled, the generalists persisted. The African sky that had once promised reliable rain now offered uncertainty. But uncertainty, it turns out, is the mother of invention. In the oscillating climate, in the mosaic landscape, in the constant dance between forest and grassland, our ancestors were learning something profound. They were learning to be human. In the fragmenting forests of Africa, around 8 to 10 million years ago, something began to shift in the way certain primates moved through their world. These were not yet humans, not even close. They were apes, cousins to the chimpanzees and gorillas we know today, spending most of their lives in the branches, their long arms perfectly suited for swinging, climbing, grasping. But the trees were becoming islands in a sea of grass. The continuous canopy that had once allowed travel for kilometers without touching ground was breaking apart. To move from one food source to another, to find water, to locate mates from other groups, these primates increasingly had to descend. And when they did, they faced a choice that would echo through millions of years: how to move across open ground. Most primates walk on all fours when on the ground, using their knuckles to support their weight, as chimpanzees and gorillas do today. It's an efficient method, stable and fast when needed. But our ancestors began experimenting with something different, something that seems awkward at first, something that no other primate had fully committed to. They began to stand upright. The earliest evidence of this shift comes from fragmentary fossils, tantalizing glimpses of creatures caught between worlds. Sahelanthropus chidensis, discovered in Chad and dating to perhaps 7 million years ago, shows a curious mix of features. Its skull suggests it might have walked upright, though the evidence is incomplete, debated, still mysterious. Ororin tugenensis, from Kenya, around 6 million years ago, offers more clarity. The structure of its thigh bone suggests bipedalism, that distinctive two-legged walk. But Ororin also had long arms and curved fingers, perfect for climbing. This creature still lived partly in trees, but when on the ground, it stood. Why? Why would natural selection favor such an unusual way of moving? The answer is not simple, and likely involves multiple advantages that accumulated over time. But let's walk through the reasoning, step by tentative step. First, consider visibility. In tall grass or mixed woodland, a quadrupedal animal sees only what's immediately around it. But stand upright, and suddenly your eyes rise above the grass. You can see predators approaching. You can spot food sources at a distance. You can locate the scattered trees that mark water sources or fruit. In an increasingly open landscape, the ability to see farther becomes a matter of survival. Second, consider energy. This seems counterintuitive at first. Bipedalism appears unstable, requiring constant balance adjustments. But studies of modern human walking reveal something remarkable. Over long distances, bipedal walking is actually more energy efficient than quadrupedal movement. Our stride, once perfected, became a pendulum, legs swinging forward with minimal muscular effort. For a species that needed to cover large territories to find food and water, this efficiency mattered. Third, consider the hands. When you walk on all fours, your hands are occupied with locomotion. But stand upright, and suddenly your hands are free. Free to carry things. Food that could be transported back to a safe location. Infants that couldn't cling as tightly to their mothers. Tools eventually, though that would come later. Stones, sticks, the raw materials of technology. Fourth, consider thermoregulation. In the intense African sun, a bipedal posture exposes less body surface to direct overhead sunlight. A standing body presents a smaller target to the sun's rays during the hottest part of the day. Coupled with the loss of body hair and increased sweating, which would come later, bipedalism helped our ancestors cope with heat in open environments. But these advantages didn't manifest overnight. The transition from occasional bipedalism to full commitment took millions of years, and the fossil record, sparse but illuminating, traces this gradual transformation. Around 4.4 million years ago lived Ardipithecus ramidus, discovered in Ethiopia in the 1910s. Ardi, as the most complete specimen was nicknamed, shows us a creature still deeply connected to the trees. Her feet retained a grasping big toe, perfect for gripping branches. Her arms were long and powerful, but her pelvis, the structure of her leg bones, the position where her spine met her skull, all suggest she could walk upright when on the ground. Ardi lived in woodland, not open savanna. Her environment was still relatively forested, but she represents a critical stage, a creature competent in trees but capable on the ground, moving bipedally when necessary, adapting to a world where trees were no longer everywhere. Then, around 3.9 million years ago, we meet Australopithecus afarensis. This species, found primarily in Ethiopia and Tanzania, represents a major step toward committed bipedalism. The most famous specimen, discovered in 1974 by paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson, was nicknamed Lucy. She was small, standing perhaps 1.1 meters tall, weighing maybe 29 kilograms, but her skeleton tells a story of transformation. Lucy's pelvis was short and broad, shaped like a basin, very different from the elongated pelvis of a chimpanzee. This configuration stabilized the trunk over the legs during walking. Her knee joint angled inward, bringing her feet closer to the body's center line with each step, providing balance. Her feet had lost the grasping big toe of earlier species. They were becoming platforms, arches forming to absorb the shock of bipedal walking. Yet Lucy still retained long arms, relatively longer than modern humans. Her fingers were slightly curved. These are signatures of a creature that still climbed, that probably slept in trees for safety, that used the vertical dimension of the environment when threatened. She was committed to bipedalism, but not entirely freed from the trees. The most poignant evidence of Australopithecine walking comes not from bones, but from footprints. At Laetoli, in Tanzania, volcanic ash fell 3.66 million years ago, covering the landscape in a fine gray powder. Soon after, perhaps within days, rain fell, turning the ash to mud. And through that mud walked several Australopithecines, leaving their footprints behind. Then more ash fell, sealing the prints, preserving them for over 3.5 million years. When these footprints were discovered in 1978 by Mary Leakey, they revealed something extraordinary. The gait was clearly bipedal. The prints show a heel strike, weight transfer along the outside of the foot, a push-off from the big toe. This is the same sequence modern humans use when walking. But more than that, there appear to be at least two individuals, possibly three, walking together. Perhaps a family. Perhaps a male, female, and child, walking side by side through the ash. Imagine them for a moment. The volcano visible in the distance, smoking. The ash still warm underfoot. The rain starting to fall. They're moving together, staying close. Perhaps they're seeking shelter. Perhaps they're simply traveling, as they do every day, covering territory in search of food. The smaller set of prints, possibly a child's, occasionally steps in the larger prints, following. They walk, and behind them, the ash receives their passage. Within hours, it hardens. Within days, it's sealed beneath more volcanic deposits. Within years, it's buried completely. But 3.66 million years later, erosion exposes the surface again, and we see them. Still walking, still together, frozen in a moment that lasted only seconds, but now echoes across unimaginable time. The Australopithecines persisted for more than 1 million years, diversifying into several species. Some remained in East Africa, others spread to South Africa, where fossils have been found in cave systems, preserved in limestone. They adapted to varied environments: woodlands, grasslands, riverine forests. Their brains were still small, about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, roughly the size of a chimpanzee's brain. But their locomotion was distinctly human. This commitment to bipedalism came with costs. Childbirth became more difficult as the pelvis narrowed to support upright walking. The spine developed curves to balance the weight of the upper body over the hips, curves that would cause back pain in modern humans. Knees and ankles took on stresses they weren't originally designed for. Even today, these joints are common sites of injury, echoes of a compromise made millions of years ago. But the benefits outweighed the costs. Bipedalism freed the hands, and free hands could do something remarkable. They could carry, they could manipulate, they could shape the world. By around 3 million years ago, Australopithecines were walking much as we walk today. Their stride wasn't identical to ours. Their proportions were different. Their movements probably still included more climbing than ours do. But the fundamental transition had occurred. They were upright. They could see across the landscape. They could travel efficiently over long distances. Their hands were available for purposes beyond locomotion. The stage was set for the next revolution, because hands that could carry could also craft. Fingers that could grasp branches could also shape stone, and brains that could navigate complex landscapes were beginning to see patterns, to imagine possibilities, to recognize that the world could be changed with tools. There is a moment, lost in deep time, that we can never witness, but can only imagine. Somewhere in East Africa, perhaps near a rocky outcrop, perhaps by a stream bed where water had exposed layers of stone, one of our ancestors picked up a rock. Not to throw it, not to use it as it was, but to strike it against another rock, deliberately, with purpose, to change its shape. The sound would have been sharp, echoing across the landscape. Crack, a flake splitting away, leaving a fresh edge, sharp enough to cut. And in that moment, something profound happened. The world stopped being something that simply happened to our ancestors. It became something they could reshape. The earliest known stone tools date to approximately 3.3 million years ago, discovered at a site called Lomekwi 3 in Kenya. These are crude implements, large cores and flakes showing clear signs of intentional striking. They predate the genus Homo entirely. This means that Australopithecines, those upright walking apes with small brains, were already toolmakers. The implications are staggering. For decades, scientists believed that tool use required large brains, that technology was the province of our own genus. But Lemaitre tells a different story. Tool making began not with big-brained humans, but with smaller-brained ancestors who had something else: free hands and the cognitive capacity to see potential in stone. By 2.6 million years ago, stone tool technology had become more sophisticated. The Oldowan tradition, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where it was first identified, represents a clear technological system. These tools were simple but effective. Cores from which flakes were removed, and the flakes themselves, each with a sharp edge. Some cores show many flake removals, suggesting systematic reduction, a plan executed over multiple strikes. Creating an Oldowan tool requires several cognitive steps. First, you must recognize that certain types of rock will fracture in predictable ways. Not all stoneworks. Lava-based rocks, like basalt and obsidian, or fine-grained sedimentary rocks, like chert, fracture conchoidally, meaning they break with curved, sharp edges. Limestone or sandstone simply crumble. Our ancestors learned to select appropriate materials. Second, you must understand angles. Strike a rock straight on, and it shatters uselessly. Strike it at the correct angle with the right force, and a flake detaches cleanly. This requires hand-eye coordination, understanding of force and trajectory, and probably considerable practice. Third, you must be able to envision the tool before it exists. You must look at an unmodified rock and see the potential within it. This capacity for mental transformation, for seeing what could be rather than just what is, marks a crucial cognitive threshold. The species most associated with these early tools is Homo habilis, whose name literally means handy man. Habilis lived from approximately 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago in East and possibly South Africa, with brain sizes ranging from 500 to 800 cubic centimeters. They were larger brained than Australopithecines, but still small compared to modern humans. Homo habilis showed clear anatomical adaptations for tool making. Their hands, while still somewhat curved, had shorter fingers and a more opposable thumb than Australopithecines. The precision grip, the ability to hold objects between thumb and fingertips with fine control, was improving. Their wrist joints allowed the rotation needed for striking stones together. Evolution was shaping hands for manipulation. But what did these tools do? Why did they matter so much? The answer lies in access. Stone tools opened up food resources that would otherwise be unavailable or difficult to exploit. A sharp flake could cut through the thick hide of a dead animal that scavengers had abandoned. Our ancestors probably weren't capable hunters yet, but they could drive off smaller scavengers or arrive after larger predators had eaten their fill. The remaining carcass, with its hide intact, would be useless to an animal without claws or cutting teeth. But with a stone flake, that hide could be pierced, the meat inside accessed. More importantly, tools provided access to bone marrow. After predators stripped a carcass of meat, they often left behind bones. These bones contained rich, fatty marrow, protected by hard outer bone that carnivore teeth could crack but not easily access. Homo habilis could use stone hammers to break open these bones, extracting marrow that was highly nutritious and often overlooked by other scavengers. Archaeological sites preserve this evidence. Bones showing both carnivore tooth marks and stone tool cut marks, with the tool marks on top, suggest scavenging after predators had finished. Bones broken in patterns consistent with marrow extraction. Concentrations of tools and broken bones at specific locations, possibly places where carcasses were carried for processing away from competitors. This dietary shift matters profoundly. Animal foods, particularly fats from marrow and brain tissue, are incredibly nutrient dense. They provide essential amino acids, omega-3 fatty acids, and other compounds crucial for brain development and function. A diet supplemented with even occasional meat and marrow would support larger, more metabolically expensive brains. And here we see the beginning of a feedback loop, one of the most important in human evolution. Tools provided access to better nutrition. Better nutrition supported larger brains. Larger brains could conceive of more sophisticated tools. Those tools provided even better nutrition. The cycle accelerated, each turn building on the last. The archaeological record shows this happening. Tool-making sites became more common. The tools themselves showed increasing sophistication, with more systematic reduction patterns, more flakes per core, more efficient use of raw material. By 1.8 million years ago, with the appearance of Homo erectus, a new tool technology emerged, the Acheulean hand axe. These hand axes were dramatically different from Oldowan tools. They were large, carefully shaped implements, often teardrop-shaped, with edges worked all around the perimeter. Creating one required dozens or even hundreds of precisely placed strikes, removing flakes in sequence to achieve a symmetrical form. The maker had to plan ahead, to see not just the next strike, but many strikes into the future, to hold in mind an image of the finished tool and work systematically toward that goal. This level of planning and execution suggests significant cognitive advancement. Homo erectus brains were larger still, reaching 900 cubic centimeters and above, approaching the lower range of modern human brain size. They were clearly capable of complex thought, of teaching others, of maintaining cultural traditions of tool-making that persisted, relatively unchanged in form, for over 1 million years. But tools were more than just sharp edges. They were information made physical. Each tool tradition represented accumulated knowledge: which rocks worked best, where to find them, how to strike them, what designs were most effective for different tasks. This knowledge had to be learned, practiced, transmitted from experienced makers to novices. Watch a modern human napper, someone who studies ancient tool-making by recreating it, and you'll see how difficult it actually is. The first attempts produce only shattered rocks. Learning to control the angle, the force, the point of impact takes hours of practice. Becoming proficient takes months or years. Our ancestors faced the same learning curve. This means teaching must have been involved, not just observation and imitation, though those played roles, but active instruction. A skilled toolmaker showing a learner where to strike, perhaps guiding their hand, demonstrating techniques, correcting errors. This is social learning. Cultural transmission, the foundation of what we would later call education. Tool-making sites often show evidence of being used repeatedly over long periods. Places where good stone was available became workshops, locations where groups would gather to quarry material and manufacture tools. Some sites show debris from thousands of tools being made, generations of tool makers returning to the same productive locations. At these sites, younger individuals could watch experienced makers, could practice with stone scraps, could learn the craft. Children's hands might account for some of the cruder tools found at these locations, practice pieces created during apprenticeship. The social dynamics of teaching and learning were becoming embedded in hominin life. Tools also extended the range of environments our ancestors could exploit. With cutting implements, tough plant materials became accessible. Roots could be dug up and processed. Hard-shelled nuts could be cracked open. Wooden tools could be sharpened to points for digging or hunting. Each innovation opened new possibilities. There is even evidence that Homo erectus used fire by around 1.5 million years ago, though this remains debated. Burned earth at some sites suggests controlled fire, but distinguishing ancient campfires from natural bushfires is difficult. What's certain is that by 1 million years ago, fire use was established, adding another transformative tool to the hominin toolkit. The cognitive implications of all this tool use cannot be overstated. These weren't instinctive behaviors, like a bird building a nest or a beaver constructing a dam. Tool-making required learned skills, passed culturally between individuals and across generations. It required planning, patience, fine motor control, and the ability to hold goals in mind while executing multiple steps toward achieving them. Brain scans of modern humans engaged in tool-making show activation in areas associated with language, planning, and sequential thinking. The neural networks that support tool-making overlap significantly with those that support speech and abstract reasoning. It's possible, even likely, that the cognitive adaptations for tool-making laid foundations for language itself. By 1 million years ago, hominins had transformed their relationship with the environment. They were no longer simply consumers of what nature provided. They were modifiers, using intelligence and skill to extract resources that would otherwise remain inaccessible. They carried their technology with them, sometimes transporting favored tools or raw materials over considerable distances. The stone tools they made have survived when almost everything else has vanished. Flesh decays, wood rots, fiber disintegrates, but stone endures. And so we can still hold the tools they made, can feel the edges they shaped, can trace with our fingers the flake scars left by strikes delivered 1 million years ago. The stone was ready. The hands were ready. Now, somewhere in the African night, sparks were beginning to fly. Imagine an African evening, perhaps 1.5 million years ago. The sun has set, and darkness wraps around a small group of hominins huddled together. They have sheltered here before, in this rocky overhang that provides some protection from the wind and from the predators whose eyes shine in the darkness beyond. Tonight, though, something is different. Tonight, there is light. A bushfire, started by lightning, has been smoldering in the distance for days. One individual, braver or more curious than the others, has brought back a burning branch. Now flames flicker against the rock face, casting dancing shadows, pushing back the night. The group draws closer, feeling warmth, seeing the darkness retreat. They do not yet understand what they have captured. They cannot know that this moment, or moments like it repeated across thousands of years, will change everything about what they are and what they will become. Fire is older than humanity. It has burned across landscapes since plants first colonized land hundreds of millions of years ago. Lightning strikes, volcanic eruptions, spontaneous combustion in sun-baked vegetation, all have created flames that swept through grasslands and forests. Animals learned to fear it, to flee from it. But our ancestors learned something different. They learned to control it. The evidence for controlled fire use is maddeningly difficult to interpret in the archaeological record. How do you distinguish between natural fires and intentional human-made fires when examining sites millions of years old? Burned earth could mean a campfire, or it could mean a bushfire that happened to pass through. Burned bones might indicate cooking, or they might simply have been caught in a wildfire. The earliest controversial evidence comes from sites like Kubifora in Kenya and Swartkrans in South Africa, dating to roughly 1.5 million years ago. Patches of reddened earth, bones with burning patterns, possible hearths. Some scientists accept this as evidence of fire control by early Homo erectus. Others remain skeptical, arguing that natural fires could explain the patterns. By 1 million years ago, the evidence becomes stronger. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, clear evidence of burned bone and plant ash appears in layers dated to 1 million years before present. The cave's depth means natural fires sweeping through are unlikely. Something was burning these materials deliberately, repeatedly, in the shelter of the cave. By 400,000 years ago, fire use was definitely widespread across Africa, Europe, and Asia. But the crucial period, when fire first became a regular, controlled part of hominin life, likely falls somewhere between 1.5 and 1 million years ago, during the time of Homo erectus. Learning to maintain fire was likely easier than learning to create it. A branch taken from a natural fire, kept burning by adding fuel, could be carried from camp to camp. Archaeological sites from this period often show evidence of repeated occupation. Perhaps one reason for returning to the same locations was that fire was kept burning there, tended constantly, a precious resource that couldn't easily be replaced. Creating fire from scratch requires either friction, as in rubbing sticks together, or using a bow drill, or percussion, striking rocks like flint and iron pyrite together to create sparks. Both methods require knowledge, skill, and appropriate materials. The evidence for deliberate fire creation is much later, perhaps only 50,000 years ago or less. For most of human evolutionary history, fire was probably maintained rather than created, borrowed from nature and carefully sustained. But whether captured or created, fire transformed hominin existence in multiple profound ways. First and most obviously, it provided warmth. Homo erectus was spreading out of tropical Africa into more temperate regions of Asia and eventually Europe. Nights in these regions could be cold, especially at higher elevations or during seasonal temperature drops. Fire made these environments inhabitable, extended the range of climates where hominins could survive. Second, fire provided protection. The African night was dangerous. Lions, leopards, hyenas all hunted after dark. A campfire kept predators at bay, creating a safe zone where the group could rest without constant vigilance. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For the first time in evolutionary history, primates could sleep soundly on the ground, protected by a ring of light and heat that no predator would willingly cross. Third, fire extended the day. With light, activities could continue after sunset. Tools could be made, food prepared, social interactions sustained. The fire-lit hours became a special time when the group gathered close, when stories might be told, when the bonds of community were strengthened in ways that daylight activities, more scattered and individual, did not encourage. Fourth, fire could be used to modify landscapes. Though this likely came later, the ability to deliberately set fires allowed hominins to shape their environments. Burning cleared brush, promoted the growth of certain edible plants, drove game animals toward hunters. This was environmental engineering on a large scale, humans beginning to actively manage the ecosystems they inhabited. But the fifth effect of fire, though perhaps not immediately obvious, was the most transformative of all. Fire made cooking possible, and cooking changed the very structure of human biology. Raw food is hard to digest. Tough plant fibers must be broken down. Raw meat is chewy, difficult to consume in large quantities. The process of digestion requires significant energy, and the digestive system must be robust, with strong jaws, large teeth, and a long, elaborate gut to extract nutrients from unprocessed food. Cooking is external digestion. Heat breaks down complex molecules. Tough fibers soften. Proteins denature and become easier for enzymes to access. Starches gelatinize, making their calories readily available. A cooked meal provides more nutrients and requires less energy to digest than the same food raw. This matters enormously because brains are metabolically expensive. The human brain, though only about 2% of body weight, consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy at rest. Supporting a large brain requires either a very large body to generate sufficient calories or a very efficient digestive system that extracts maximum nutrition from food, or a diet so rich in calories that plenty of energy is available even after meeting basic metabolic needs. Cooking provided that dietary richness. Cooked foods deliver more usable calories per unit of chewing and digesting effort. This meant that hominins could afford, energetically, to support larger brains. But it also meant they could afford to reduce other expensive systems. The gut could become shorter, more efficient, less metabolically costly. Teeth could become smaller. Jaw muscles could weaken. And this is exactly what we see in the fossil record. Homo erectus, living at the time when fire use was becoming established, shows significant reduction in tooth size compared to earlier hominins. The jaw is less robust. The skull shows reduced attachment areas for chewing muscles. These are anatomical signals that diet had changed, that food was being processed before eating, that less mechanical effort was required for chewing. At the same time, brain size was increasing dramatically. Homo erectus brains ranged from 900 to 100 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than earlier species. Later hominins would grow larger still, eventually reaching and exceeding modern human averages of around 1,400 cubic centimeters. This expansion tracks closely with evidence for fire use and presumably cooking. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that cooking was the catalyst that made humans human, that it unlocked the potential for brain expansion in a way nothing else could. His cooking hypothesis suggests that once hominins became dependent on cooked food, they were permanently changed. A modern human cannot survive long-term on a diet of only raw foods. We simply cannot extract sufficient calories to maintain our metabolic needs, particularly our hungry brains. Cooking also had social implications. Prepared food could be shared more easily, strengthening reciprocal relationships. A raw carcass can be torn apart and consumed individually. But a cooking fire becomes a gathering point, a shared resource. Food cooked together is often eaten together, creating opportunities for social bonding, for sharing stories, for negotiating relationships. There is something deeply human about gathering around a fire to eat. Every culture on Earth does this. The hearth, the campfire, the cooking fire is central to human social life. This behavior likely has roots stretching back over 1 million years to those first fires that pushed back the darkness and transformed raw flesh and tubers into nourishing meals. Fire also required cooperation and planning. Maintaining fire meant collecting fuel, a task that required time and effort. Someone had to tend the fire, adding wood as needed, protecting it from wind and rain. This likely encouraged division of labor, with different individuals contributing in different ways to the group's survival. The cognitive demands of fire management should not be underestimated. Fire is dangerous. It can burn, can spread uncontrollably, can destroy as easily as it creates. Using fire safely requires understanding its properties, predicting its behavior, knowing how to contain it and control it. These are not simple skills. They require observation, learning, memory, and the ability to think ahead. Teaching fire management would have been crucial. A child playing carelessly with fire could injure themselves or others. Learning which woods burned best, how to structure a fire for cooking versus warmth, how to transport burning brands without extinguishing them or starting unintended fires. All this knowledge had to be transmitted culturally. By the time Homo heidelbergensis appeared, around 700,000 years ago, and later Homo sapiens, around 300,000 years ago, fire use was ubiquitous. Archaeological sites from this period routinely show hearths, burned bones, fire-cracked rocks used for heat retention in cooking. Fire had become so integral to hominin life that it was inconceivable to live without it. The mastery of fire marked a turning point. For the first time, a species was using energy from outside its own body to transform the world. Fire provided heat independent of metabolism, light independent of the sun, protection independent of physical strength, and food processing independent of biological digestive capabilities. In a sense, fire was the first technology that made us dependent on technology. Once our ancestors became obligate cooks, once our biology adapted to cooked food with smaller guts and larger brains, we could no longer survive without fire. We had crossed a threshold had committed ourselves to a path that required culture and technology for survival. Sitting by a fire, feeling its warmth, watching flames flicker and dance, is to connect with something ancient. Every fire humans have ever lit shares kinship with those first flames, captured from lightning strikes or lava flows, tended carefully through countless nights, never allowed to die because rekindling might be impossible. The fire burned, the darkness retreated, and around its warmth, fed by its cooking, protected by its light, our ancestors' brains grew larger, their thoughts more complex, their communities more bonded. Fire had given them a gift beyond warmth or safety. It had given them the biological foundation for consciousness itself. Around the fire, in the flickering shadows, faces turned toward one another. Eyes met, hands gestured, and from throats that had once produced only grunts and cries, something new began to emerge. Sounds that meant things, sounds that could refer to what was not present, to what had happened before, to what might happen tomorrow. Sounds that could share the contents of one mind with another. Language, the bridge between isolation and communion, the tool that made all other tools possible. But when did it begin? This is one of the great mysteries of human evolution and one of the most difficult to solve. Language doesn't fossilize. Words leave no traces in stone. We cannot excavate ancient conversations or carbon date forgotten stories. Instead, we must look at indirect evidence, at anatomical changes that might enable speech, at archaeological remains that suggest symbolic thinking, at the structure of modern languages themselves for clues to their ancient origins. The anatomy of speech is complex, requiring precise coordination of multiple systems. Air from the lungs must pass through the larynx or voice box, where vocal cords vibrate to produce sound. That sound then moves through the throat and mouth, where the tongue, lips, and soft palate shape it into distinct phonemes, the basic units of speech. Modern humans can produce a remarkable range of sounds, dozens of distinct phonemes that combine in endless patterns to create words. Other primates cannot do this. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have a larynx positioned high in the throat, allowing them to breathe and swallow simultaneously, reducing the risk of choking. But this configuration limits the range of sounds they can produce. Their tongues are less flexible, their vocal control less precise. They can vocalize, certainly, with a rich repertoire of calls and cries, but these are not speech. Humans have a descended larynx, positioned lower in the throat. This creates a longer vocal tract, allowing for more acoustic variation. But it comes with a cost. The lowered larynx means that food and air pathways cross, creating a choking hazard that doesn't exist in other primates. Evolution made this trade-off, accepting increased risk for increased vocal flexibility. This suggests that speech was highly advantageous, so advantageous that it was worth the danger. When did this anatomical reorganization occur? Fossil throats don't preserve, but skulls do, and skulls provide clues. The shape of the skull base, where the spine connects, reflects larynx position. In modern humans, the skull base is flexed, bent to accommodate the descended larynx. In chimpanzees and early hominins, it's flatter. Homo erectus shows some flexion, suggesting that laryngeal descent had begun, perhaps allowing for somewhat more complex vocalizations than earlier species. But full, modern flexion appears only with later species, probably not until Homo heidelbergensis around 600,000 years ago, and definitely by the time of Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago. Another clue comes from the hypoglossal canal, a channel in the skull through which the nerve-controlling tongue movement passes. A larger canal might suggest more sophisticated tongue control, necessary for speech. Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals have large hypoglossal canals, similar to modern humans, again suggesting speech capabilities. But anatomy alone doesn't prove language existed. Parrots can produce human speech sounds, but don't have language in the meaningful sense. What distinguishes human language is not just the sounds, but what we do with them. Symbolic reference, grammar, recursion, the ability to combine and recombine elements infinitely to express novel thoughts. Genetics offers another window into language evolution. The FOXP2 gene, sometimes called the language gene, plays a crucial role in developing neural circuits for speech and language. Mutations in FOXP2 cause severe speech and language impairments in humans. When scientists compared FOXP2 across species, they found that the human version differs from the chimpanzee version in ways that appeared relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Studies of Neanderthal DNA recovered from fossils show that Neanderthals had the same FOXP2 variant as modern humans. This suggests that the genetic foundation for language was in place at least by the time the Neanderthal and human lineages diverged, perhaps 600,000 years ago. Whether this means Neanderthals had full language remains debated, but they certainly had the genetic equipment for it. Beyond anatomy and genetics, behavior provides evidence. Language allows for complex planning, for transmitting detailed information across generations, for teaching sophisticated skills. When we see evidence of these behaviors in the archaeological record, we can infer that language, or something approaching it, probably existed. The Acheulean hand axes, appearing 1.7 million years ago, show remarkable standardization across vast regions and time periods. The same basic design persisted for over 1 million years. Creating these symmetrical tools required learned skills, possibly taught through demonstration and proto-linguistic communication. But the tools themselves don't require full language to explain. Observation and imitation might suffice. By 300,000 years ago, however, tool technologies were becoming more complex. Middle Stone Age tools from Africa show hafting, where stone points were attached to wooden shafts with plant adhesives. Creating these composite tools required planning, gathering different materials from different locations, processing them in specific sequences, and knowing which adhesives worked best and how to prepare them. This level of technological sophistication strongly suggests language. Teaching someone to make hafted tools through gesture alone would be extremely difficult. But with language, you could say, first, find the straight branch. Heat the adhesive until it's sticky. Wrap the sinew while it's still warm. Each step could be explained, corrected, refined through verbal instruction. Even more telling is the evidence of symbolic behavior. Ochre, a red mineral pigment, appears at African sites from 300,000 years ago onward. Pieces of ochre have been found with grinding marks, showing they were processed into powder. What was this powder for? Body decoration, perhaps. Ritual use, creating art. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, pieces of ochre dated to 100,000 years ago bear engraved geometric patterns, deliberate abstract designs. This is unambiguous symbolic behavior. Someone made these marks intentionally, creating patterns that existed first in their mind, then in the physical world. This kind of abstract, symbolic thinking is deeply connected to language, which is itself a symbolic system where sounds represent concepts. Shell beads appear around the same time, perforated shells that were clearly worn as ornaments or jewelry. Creating personal adornment requires aesthetic sense, social conventions about what looks good or what particular ornaments signify, and the cognitive ability to think about how others will perceive you. All of this strongly implies language. Burial of the dead, which appears by 100,000 years ago or earlier, suggests ritual behavior and possibly belief in an afterlife or spiritual realm. These are concepts that almost certainly require language to develop and maintain within a community. How could complex beliefs about death and the supernatural be transmitted without words? By 70,000 years ago, when modern humans began their expansion out of Africa, they carried with them sophisticated toolkits, shell beads, ochre for decoration, and clearly established cultural traditions. They were fully linguistic beings, as capable of speech and symbolic thought as any human living today. But language did more than allow for better tools or ritual behavior. It fundamentally transformed social life. With language, knowledge could accumulate across generations. A grandmother could tell her grandchildren where the best fruit trees grew, even though those trees might be days of travel away and not fruiting at the moment. A successful hunter could describe in precise detail how he stalked and killed an animal, passing on strategies that others could adopt. Language enabled gossip, the sharing of information about social relationships. Who was trustworthy? Who had helped or harmed others? Who was forming alliances? This kind of social information is crucial in large groups, where not everyone interacts directly with everyone else. Reputation, maintained through language, became a form of social capital. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar has proposed that language evolved primarily for social bonding, serving a function similar to grooming in other primates, but far more efficient. Grooming can involve only two individuals at a time and requires physical proximity. Language allows one person to communicate with many simultaneously, to bond with individuals not physically present through storytelling, and to maintain much larger social networks. Dunbar's research suggests that human cognitive capacity allows us to maintain stable relationships with about 150 people, a number that appears across hunter-gatherer societies, military units, and even modern social networks. This is far larger than the groups other primates maintain, and language makes it possible. With language came the ability to create shared myths, stories that bound communities together. Creation myths explaining where the people came from, stories of ancestors and their deeds. Tales teaching moral lessons or explaining natural phenomena. These narratives created shared identity, a sense of we that extended beyond immediate kin to encompass an entire linguistic community. Language also enabled deception and persuasion. For the first time, an individual could say something that wasn't true, could make claims about the past or promises about the future that might never materialize. This created new social dynamics, requiring listeners to evaluate speaker credibility, to develop theory of mind, the ability to understand that others might have beliefs different from reality. The arms race between deception and detection likely drove further cognitive development. Being able to detect lies, to read subtle cues of body language and vocal tone, to track consistency across multiple statements, all require sophisticated social intelligence. And language made all of this possible and necessary. Around the fire, after dark, these linguistic abilities would have flourished. The firelit hours became special time for storytelling, for teaching, for negotiating relationships, and resolving conflicts through words rather than violence. Children learned language by listening to adults speak, absorbing not just vocabulary and grammar, but the stories and knowledge of their culture. The human capacity for language is truly remarkable. Children acquire language effortlessly, without explicit instruction, simply through exposure. This suggests that our brains are specifically adapted for language learning, with neural circuits dedicated to extracting patterns from speech sounds, inferring grammatical rules, and mapping sounds to meanings. No other species learns communication systems this way. A chimpanzee can be taught sign language, but only laboriously, with explicit training, and never achieves the fluency or creativity of a human child. We are born for language. It is as natural to us as breathing. The exact timing of when full language emerged remains uncertain. Conservative estimates suggest perhaps 100,000 years ago, based on clear evidence of symbolic behavior. More liberal estimates push it back to 500,000 years ago, or even earlier, based on anatomical changes and the complexity of social coordination implied by archaeological remains. What seems certain is that by the time humans left Africa 70,000 years ago, they were fully linguistic beings. They carried with them not just tools and fire, but stories, songs, myths, and accumulated knowledge encoded in words. This linguistic inheritance was as crucial to their success as any physical technology. Language made humans cumulative learners. Each generation could build on the discoveries of previous generations, could preserve innovations through verbal instruction, could share knowledge across vast distances and spans of time. We didn't have to rediscover fire in every generation, didn't have to independently invent toolmaking. We inherited these technologies through culture, transmitted by language. In the firelight, voices rose and fell, telling stories of the day's hunt, of ancestors long dead, of the spirits that move through the landscape. Words wove webs of meaning, connected minds to other minds, bridged the gap between inner experience and shared reality. They spoke, and in speaking, they became fully human. But the climate was not finished testing them. The sky, that had already transformed the forests into savannas, had more changes in store. The world would swing between extremes of wet and dry, warm and cool, and only the most adaptable, the most intelligent, the most cooperative would survive. The Earth breathes in cycles, vast, slow rhythms of warmth and cold that span tens of thousands of years. These cycles are driven by subtle changes in our planet's orbit and axial tilt. Variations so slight they seem inconsequential. But over millennia, they accumulate, shifting the amount and distribution of sunlight reaching Earth's surface, triggering feedback loops that plunge the world into ice ages or release it into warmer interglacial periods. Africa, straddling the equator, never froze beneath glaciers as Europe and Northern Asia did. But the climate oscillations that locked vast quantities of water in polar ice sheets had profound effects on the African continent. As ice advanced at higher latitudes, global sea levels dropped. Weather patterns shifted. The great monsoon systems that brought rain to Africa weakened or changed their trajectories, and periodically, the continent experienced megadroughts, extended periods of extreme aridity that transformed the landscape and tested every living thing to its limits. For the past 3 million years, these climate oscillations have intensified, becoming more dramatic, more unpredictable. And it is during this period, this time of maximum environmental instability, that the human lineage evolved. Coincidence? Almost certainly not. The variability itself became a selective pressure, favoring not adaptation to any single environment, but adaptability itself. Around 2.8 million years ago, the Earth's climate shifted into a pattern of regular glacial cycles. Ice sheets began forming and melting in rhythmic pulses, driven by Milankovitch cycles, those orbital variations named after the Serbian scientist who explained them. These cycles operate on different timescales. The eccentricity of Earth's orbit changes over roughly 100,000 years. The tilt of the axis oscillates over 41,000 years. And the wobble or precession of the axis completes a cycle every 26,000 years. When these cycles align in certain ways, summers in the northern hemisphere become cooler, not warm enough to melt the previous winter's snow. Ice accumulates year after year, building into massive sheets kilometers thick that grind slowly outward from the poles. The ice reflects sunlight, cooling the planet further in a reinforcing feedback loop. Global temperatures drop, rainfall patterns change, and in Africa, the effects ripple through every ecosystem. During glacial periods, Africa became drier. The great rainforests of the Congo shrank to isolated refugia. The savanna woodlands opened into sparse grasslands or semi-desert. Lakes that had provided reliable water sources dried up or diminished to brackish pools. Rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal, rushing torrents during brief wet seasons, then dry channels of sand. Marine sediment cores from off the African coast preserved dust layers, evidence of massive dust storms during glacial periods when vegetation cover declined and winds swept across exposed soil. These dust layers correspond to periods of extreme aridity, times when the continent would have been harsh, challenging, offering little margin for error. Yet hominins persisted. The fossil record shows this clearly. Sites dated to glacial periods contain stone tools, animal bones bearing butchery marks, evidence of continued occupation even as environments became more demanding. How did they survive? The answer lies in the very traits that define humanity: behavioral flexibility, technological innovation, social cooperation, and cognitive capacity. Each climate swing created new challenges, and meeting those challenges required adaptation, not through biological evolution, which operates too slowly to track such rapid changes, but through cultural evolution, through learning and innovation that could be shared within a single generation. Homo erectus, living through many of these climate oscillations from about 1.9 million years ago onward, showed remarkable adaptability. They spread across Africa and into Asia, encountering diverse environments from tropical forests to temperate woodlands to near-desert conditions. Their tool technologies remained relatively stable, but their behaviors clearly varied based on local conditions. In wetter periods, they occupied open grasslands, hunting large game animals that thrived on abundant grass. In drier periods, they may have concentrated near permanent water sources, rivers and lakes that persisted even when seasonal rains failed. They learned to predict where animals would come to drink, where edible plants could be found even in drought, how to survive lean times by broadening their diet to include foods they might otherwise ignore. The archaeological record from this period shows evidence of increasing dietary breadth. Sites contain remains not just of large game animals, but also of smaller prey: tortoises, lizards, birds, rodents. There is evidence of shellfish consumption from coastal and lakeside sites. Processing of underground storage organs, tubers, and roots that remain available even when above-ground vegetation withers became important. This dietary flexibility was crucial. Specialists, animals, adapted to eating specific foods in specific environments, suffered when conditions changed. Generalists, able to switch between food sources and habitats, survived. And hominins were becoming the ultimate generalists. By around 600,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis appeared, with brain sizes approaching modern human ranges. These were sophisticated hunters, capable of taking down large and dangerous prey. Sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya show evidence of butchery of elephants, hippos, and other megafauna. But these same sites also show that when large game was scarce, Heidelbergensis turned to other resources: small animals, fish, plant foods. The climate continued its oscillations. Warm, wet, interglacial periods alternated with cold, dry glacial phases. Each cycle lasted roughly 100,000 years, though with considerable variation. Within each major cycle, smaller fluctuations occurred, creating a nested pattern of variability at multiple timescales. Conditions could change dramatically within a single lifetime, requiring constant adjustment. Around 300,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens emerged, their fossils found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. These early modern humans had lighter, more graceful skeletons than Heidelbergensis, reduced tooth size, and skulls with the characteristic rounded shape and vertical foreheads of later humans. Their brains were modern in size, around 1,400 cubic centimeters or more. But most importantly, they showed unprecedented behavioral sophistication. Their stone tool technologies were more diverse and refined. They created specialized tools for specific tasks: projectile points for hunting, scrapers for processing hides awls for perforating materials. They transported raw materials over long distances, suggesting planning and knowledge of regional geography. They used fire routinely, not just for warmth and protection, but for complex purposes. Heat treatment of stone, heating certain types of rock to change their flaking properties and make them easier to work, appears in the archaeological record. This requires understanding of how materials respond to heat, careful control of fire temperature, and patience to execute the process correctly. Evidence of coastal resource exploitation increases during this period. Shell middens, accumulations of discarded shellfish shells, appear at sites along the African coasts. Collecting shellfish is a reliable foraging strategy, providing concentrated protein and fat from a renewable resource that can be gathered without sophisticated hunting technology. During dry periods, when inland resources were scarce, coastal populations may have had significant advantages. By 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had spread across Africa, from the Mediterranean coast to the Cape of Good Hope, from Atlantic shores to the East African highlands. They occupied every major habitat type the continent offered: deserts, mountains, forests, grasslands, and coasts. This ecological breadth is striking. No other hominin species had achieved such wide distribution within Africa. Each environment presented different challenges. In the high-altitude Ethiopian highlands, cold nights and thin air required physiological and behavioral adaptations. In the Kalahari and Sahara regions during dry phases, finding water became paramount. In dense forests, navigation and foraging strategies differed from those effective in open grasslands, and Homo sapiens mastered all of these, developing local knowledge and specialized strategies for each. This ecological success came during one of the most climatically unstable periods in Earth's recent history. Between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, the climate was particularly volatile. Lake-level records from East Africa show dramatic fluctuations, with lakes expanding to cover vast areas during wet phases, then shrinking to nothing during droughts. Pollen records reveal vegetation changing rapidly, forests advancing and retreating in rhythm with rainfall variations. Around 135,000 years ago, conditions briefly warmed and moistened, creating a verdant period called the Eemian Interglacial. Forests expanded, lakes filled. But by 115,000 years ago, the climate was deteriorating again, sliding into the most recent major glacial period, which would last until about 12,000 years ago. During this glacial period, Africa experienced several severe megadroughts. One around 90,000 years ago was particularly intense. Genetic studies of modern human populations suggest that around this time, the total human population may have crashed to as few as 10,000 individuals, perhaps even less. This bottleneck shows up as reduced genetic diversity in all modern humans compared to what would be expected from a large, stable population. The survivors of this bottleneck were those who could adapt, who could find ways to extract resources from degraded environments, who could maintain social cohesion even under stress. And they were located, almost certainly, in refugia, places where water persisted even during extreme drought. Coastal areas with reliable marine resources, spring-fed oases, in otherwise arid regions, high-altitude zones that captured moisture from passing weather systems. By 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, a small group of these survivors stood at the edge of Africa, looking across the narrow strait into Arabia. The climate was changing again, one of the periodic fluctuations within the larger glacial period. For a brief window, conditions improved. The Sahara, today an impassable desert, became semi-arid grassland with seasonal rivers. Arabia, equally forbidding now, supported vegetation and wildlife. This window of opportunity would not last long, perhaps only a few thousand years, but it was enough. A small population, perhaps just a few hundred or thousand individuals, made the crossing, either walking across the Sinai Peninsula when sea levels were low, or crossing the narrow Red Sea Strait, possibly using simple watercraft or taking advantage of exceptionally low water levels. They carried with them everything their African heritage had given them: bodies adapted to tropical heat, minds capable of language and symbolic thought, technologies of stone and fire, and most crucially, the behavioral flexibility that had allowed their ancestors to survive millions of years of climate variability. They had been forged in the crucible of Africa's oscillating climate, tested again and again by drought and abundance, hardship and opportunity. The descendants of this small group would eventually populate every continent except Antarctica, would diversify into every human culture that exists today, would build civilizations and technologies beyond anything imaginable to those first emigrants. The Ice Ages tested humanity in its birthplace, and humanity, shaped by fire and stone, by language and social bonds, by the intelligence forged through 2 million years of environmental instability, passed the test. They survived, not by becoming perfectly adapted to any single condition, but by becoming adaptable to all conditions. If you could design the perfect training ground for a species destined to inhabit every environment on Earth, you might well create something very much like Africa. Not the Africa of comfortable stability, but the Africa of the past 3 million years. Vast, diverse, unpredictable, demanding, and rich with both opportunity and danger. This was the gymnasium where humanity trained for the marathon that would carry it across the planet. Consider first the sheer scale of environmental diversity packed into a single continent. Africa spans from 37 degrees north to 35 degrees south, straddling the equator and encompassing nearly every climate zone Earth offers. In the north, the Mediterranean climate of the coastal regions gives way to the world's largest hot desert, the Sahara, where surface temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius and years may pass without rain. Move south through the Sahel, a transitional zone of semi-arid grassland where rainfall is marginal and unpredictable, where life hangs in constant balance between survival and collapse. Further south still, the savannas open out, those mosaic landscapes of grass and scattered trees that became humanity's primary evolutionary theater. Then the great equatorial rainforests, the Congo Basin, where humidity approaches 100% and rain falls almost daily, where the canopy blocks the sun and creates a twilight world beneath. East Africa's highlands rise to touch snow, with Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya, wearing permanent glaciers despite sitting nearly on the equator. These mountains create their own weather, capturing moisture from passing air masses, creating islands of cool, temperate conditions in the midst of tropical heat. The Great Rift Valley drops below sea level in places, creating hot, arid lowlands where survival demands extraordinary physiological tolerance. Further south, the Kalahari and Namib deserts present yet different challenges. Cold nights, even after scorching days. Fog banks rolling in from the Atlantic, providing the only moisture some areas receive, and everywhere coasts. The Atlantic western shore, the Mediterranean north, the Red Sea northeast, the Indian Ocean east, each with its own marine resources, tidal patterns, and ecological opportunities. A species learning to survive across this diversity had to become flexible. Strategies that worked in the humid Congo would fail in the Sahara. Techniques effective in the highlands would be useless on the coast. But a species that mastered all of these environments, that learned to read each landscape and adapt its behavior accordingly, that species would be prepared for anything the world could offer. Temperature extremes were particularly important. Humans are tropical animals fundamentally, evolved under the equatorial sun, but within Africa, they encountered cold that demanded behavioral adaptations. Fire, clothing, shelter. The Ethiopian highlands can experience frost. The Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa see snow. Learning to cope with these conditions within Africa meant that when humans eventually migrated to Ice Age Europe or Northern Asia, they already had the cognitive toolkit for dealing with cold. Conversely, the hottest environments on Earth lie in Africa. The Danakil Depression in Ethiopia, one of the hottest places on the planet, regularly exceeds 45 degrees Celsius. Surviving such heat requires understanding of thermoregulation, knowing when to move and when to rest, where to find shade, how much water the body needs. Humans evolved hairlessness and prolific sweating as adaptations to African heat, but equally important were the behavioral strategies. Traveling in early morning or evening, seeking shelter during midday, knowing where water could be found. Water scarcity and water abundance both shaped human evolution in Africa. During dry seasons or drought periods, water became the limiting factor for survival. Knowing the landscape intimately, remembering where springs emerged, where rivers retained pools even when their channels dried, where roots or tubers contained moisture, this knowledge meant life or death. Humans developed the cognitive capacity for detailed spatial memory, mental maps spanning hundreds of kilometers, tracking resources that might only be accessible seasonally. But Africa also taught humans to deal with water abundance. Seasonal flooding in the Okavango Delta, the Sud wetlands of South Sudan, and countless river systems created temporarily vast aquatic environments. Exploiting these seasonal bounties required different skills: fishing techniques, knowledge of aquatic plants, ability to navigate waterlogged terrain. The flexibility to shift between water scarcity and abundance was another form of adaptability training. The disease environment of Africa is perhaps the most challenging on Earth. Malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes, has exerted enormous selective pressure on African populations, resulting in genetic adaptations like the sickle cell trait that provide resistance but at a cost. Trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, carried by tsetse flies, schistosomiasis from freshwater snails, countless parasites, bacteria, and viruses that flourish in warm, moist conditions. Humans evolved in this disease crucible, developing immune systems of remarkable sophistication. The genetic diversity of the human immune system is highest in African populations, reflecting millions of years of pathogen exposure and evolutionary response. When humans eventually left Africa, they carried this robust immunity with them, though they would encounter new pathogens in new lands that required further adaptation. The predator landscape of Africa was unmatched anywhere on Earth. Lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, cheetahs. The diversity and density of large carnivores in Africa exceeded all other continents. These predators were intelligent, adaptable, and dangerous. Learning to coexist with them, to predict their behavior, to avoid becoming prey, while potentially competing for the same game animals, required constant vigilance and sophisticated social strategies. Humans learn to read the landscape for signs of predators, alarm calls of other animals, movement in tall grass, tracks in soft earth, the location of carcasses that might attract scavengers. They learn to use fire to keep predators at bay, to build shelters that offered protection, to move in groups where many eyes could watch for danger. These anti-predator strategies, refined over millions of years in Africa, gave humans the awareness and caution they would need in encountering unfamiliar predators in new continents. The megafauna of Africa also presented both challenges and opportunities. Elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, giraffes, various species of buffalo and antelope, some of enormous size. Hunting these animals required courage, planning, cooperation, and technology. Humans learned to craft weapons, to coordinate group hunts, to track wounded animals over long distances, to butcher massive carcasses efficiently. But they also learned which animals to avoid, which were too dangerous to be worth the risk. African megafauna that co-evolved with humans learned to fear them, developing wariness that persists today. When humans later encountered naive megafauna in other continents, animals that had no evolutionary experience with human hunters, the results were often catastrophic for those species. But in Africa, both hunters and hunted had evolved together, creating a dynamic balance. Plant resources in Africa are incredibly diverse, with thousands of species that humans learn to exploit. Many are toxic or require processing to be edible. Cassava must be prepared carefully to remove cyanide compounds. Certain seeds need roasting or grinding. Learning which plants were safe, which required processing, how to prepare them, represented accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. This botanical knowledge included medicinal plants. While direct evidence is scarce in the archaeological record, modern hunter-gatherer societies in Africa possess extensive pharmacopoeias, using plants to treat wounds, infections, digestive problems, and pain. This knowledge likely has deep roots, representing thousands of generations of experimentation and observation. The size of Africa itself mattered for human evolution. It's the second largest continent, providing enough space for large populations to persist even during climate downturns. Population size is crucial for maintaining genetic diversity and cultural knowledge. Too small a population risks inbreeding and loss of cultural innovations. Africa's vastness meant that even during severe climate challenges, refugia existed where populations could survive. Large size also meant isolation was possible within the continent. Populations in the Cape of South Africa might have limited contact with populations in the Horn of Africa, thousands of kilometers away. This geographic structure allowed for some regional differentiation, with different populations developing slightly different tool technologies or strategies, which could then mix when populations expanded during better climate phases. This balance between isolation and connection fostered innovation. Trade networks appeared early in Africa, with raw materials like obsidian and ochre being transported hundreds of kilometers from their sources. This indicates social connections spanning large distances, groups maintaining relationships with distant neighbors, knowledge and materials flowing across the landscape. These networks would become crucial when humans eventually left Africa, as maintaining connections with other groups provided resilience against local disasters. The diversity of African environments also meant that innovation in one region could spread to others. A technique developed for fishing in lakes could be adapted for coastal environments. A hunting strategy effective on the savanna could be modified for woodland. This cross-fertilization of ideas, enabled by maintaining contact between regions while also allowing for regional specialization, created a dynamic of continuous innovation. Genetic studies reveal that African populations maintain the highest genetic diversity of any human populations on Earth. Non-African populations show reduced diversity, reflecting their origin from small founding groups. This African genetic diversity represents millions of years of accumulated mutations, population mixings, and evolutionary responses to diverse challenges. It's a repository of adaptive potential, a genetic library containing solutions to countless problems. There is a moment, invisible to us across the vast distance of time, when a small group of humans stood at the boundary of everything they had ever known. Perhaps they gathered on the Sinai Peninsula, looking northeast toward Arabia. Perhaps they huddled on the shores of the Red Sea, watching the water retreat during low tide, revealing a pathway across the strait. The exact location and moment are lost. But somewhere, sometime around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, that step was taken. Humans left Africa. It was not the first attempt. The fossil and archaeological record suggests earlier dispersals, tentative explorations beyond Africa's borders. Homo erectus had left much earlier, perhaps 1.9 million years ago, spreading across Asia and reaching as far as modern-day Indonesia. But those earlier emigrants, while successful in their own terms, did not give rise to all modern humans. They were evolutionary side branches, fascinating in their own right, but ultimately not our direct ancestors. Around 120,000 years ago, during a warm interglacial period, modern Homo sapiens may have briefly entered the Middle East. Fossils from Skul and Kafse caves in Israel, dated to roughly this time, show anatomically modern humans living alongside Neanderthals. But this population apparently didn't persist or expand. When climate conditions deteriorated again, as the glacial period intensified, these early immigrants may have died out or retreated back to Africa. The successful migration, the one that would ultimately populate the entire world, came later. And it came from a small, founding population, possibly just a few hundred to a few thousand individuals. We know this from genetics. When scientists compare DNA sequences from people around the world, they find something striking. Non-African populations have significantly less genetic diversity than African populations. This pattern is exactly what you would expect from a founder effect when a small group splits off from a larger population. The small group carries only a subset of the genetic variation present in the original population. As their descendants spread and multiply, they carry forward this reduced diversity. Every human alive today whose ancestors lived outside Africa descends from that small founding group. The genetic evidence is remarkably detailed. Mitochondrial DNA passed only through mothers and Y chromosome DNA passed only through fathers have been used to trace human migrations with extraordinary precision. These genetic markers accumulate mutations at relatively predictable rates, providing a molecular clock that can estimate when populations diverged from one another. The data consistently points to an African origin for all modern humans, with the exodus occurring roughly 70,000 to 60,000 years ago. All non-African populations are more closely related to each other than any of them is to African populations, indicating they all descend from a single immigrant group. Within that immigrant group, further subdivisions occurred as populations spread into different regions. But the initial bottleneck is clear. Why did they leave? What drove this successful migration when earlier attempts had apparently failed? The answer likely involves multiple factors aligning: environmental opportunity, population pressure, and perhaps the development of new technologies or social structures that made long-distance migration more feasible. The climate around 70,000 years ago was fluctuating within the larger glacial period. Sea levels were lower than today because of water locked in polar ice, but not at their lowest point. The Red Sea Strait between Africa and Arabia may have been significantly narrower, possibly even partially exposed during the lowest tides, creating a land bridge or shallow crossing. More importantly, Arabia was not the harsh desert it is today. During periodic increases in monsoon strength, Arabia received enough rainfall to support vegetation, creating corridors of grassland and woodland connecting Africa to southwestern Asia. These greener periods provided pathways through otherwise inhospitable terrain, windows of opportunity lasting perhaps only a few thousand years before conditions deteriorated again. Archaeological evidence supports this climatic opportunity. Stone tools from this period have been found in Arabia, showing clear African affinities in their style and technology. These tools appear at sites that also contain evidence of lakes and rivers, now long vanished beneath the sand. The migrants were following water and the life it supported, moving through landscapes that would later become impassable. But opportunity alone doesn't compel migration. There must have been push factors as well as pull factors. Population growth within Africa may have created pressure on resources, encouraging groups to explore beyond traditional territories. Competition between groups, conflicts over access to water or hunting grounds could have motivated some to seek new lands. There's also intriguing, though controversial, evidence that a catastrophic event might have provided impetus. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia erupted in one of the largest volcanic explosions of the past 2 million years. The eruption ejected thousands of cubic kilometers of ash and aerosols into the atmosphere, possibly triggering a volcanic winter lasting years or even decades. Some scientists have proposed that this event caused a severe population bottleneck in humans and other species, dramatically reducing population sizes and potentially spurring survivors to migrate in search of resources. The genetic evidence of reduced diversity in modern humans is consistent with such a bottleneck occurring around this time. However, the magnitude of Toba's impact remains debated, with some evidence suggesting its effects may have been less severe than initially thought. Regardless of the specific triggers, the migration occurred. And once begun, it proceeded with remarkable speed in evolutionary terms. Within 20,000 years, humans had reached Australia, crossing significant water barriers that required seafaring capabilities. By 45,000 years ago, they were in Europe. By 15,000 years ago, they had entered the Americas, completing the colonization of every habitable continent. This rapid dispersal was possible because of everything Africa had taught them. They carried sophisticated tool technologies that could be adapted to new resources. Their Levallois technique for producing stone flakes allowed for efficient use of available stone materials, whatever their type. They could craft specialized tools quickly, adapting their toolkit to local conditions. They carried fire, that transformative technology that made cold climates habitable, that allowed for cooking whatever foods they encountered, that provided light and protection in unfamiliar landscapes. Fire may have been even more crucial outside Africa, where winters brought cold unknown in equatorial regions. They carried language, allowing them to share information rapidly, to teach the next generation about new plants and animals, to coordinate hunting of unfamiliar prey, to maintain social cohesion, even under the stress of migration into the unknown. They carried social structures that allowed groups to cooperate, to share resources during lean times, to maintain trade and marriage networks that connected distant bands, providing resilience against local disasters. These social networks would stretch along the migration routes, maintaining connections between groups even as populations expanded. And they carried clothing. While clothing doesn't preserve in archaeological sites from this period, genetic studies of body lice suggest humans began wearing clothes regularly around 170,000 years ago. Body lice, unlike head lice, live in clothing rather than on skin, and their evolutionary divergence from head lice provides a molecular clock for when clothes became common. Clothing would become essential as humans moved into temperate and cold climates. The route of migration has been traced through archaeology and genetics, from northeastern Africa through the Sinai Peninsula or across the Red Sea Strait into Arabia. Following the coastlines northward and eastward, exploiting coastal resources as well as inland opportunities. The coast provided a relatively stable environment with predictable resources: shellfish, fish, seabirds, seals in some regions. Some groups continued eastward along the Indian Ocean coast, reaching India, Southeast Asia, and eventually Australia. Others moved northward into the Levant and from there into Europe and Asia. Each branching represented a population split, with some individuals moving on while others remained, establishing the genetic patterns we see today. When these emigrants encountered Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East, and Denisovans in Asia, they sometimes interbred with them. Modern, non-African humans carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of this ancient mixing. Some Asian and Oceanian populations carry Denisovan DNA as well, but African populations generally lack these archaic human contributions, confirming their ancestors remained in Africa while these interbreeding events occurred elsewhere. The success of these migrants is remarkable. They entered environments utterly unlike Africa: temperate forests, treeless steppes, frozen tundra, mountain ranges, isolated islands. They encountered animals they had never seen: mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, marsupials in Australia. They faced winters with snow and ice, summers with midnight sun in high latitudes, seasonal extremes far more pronounced than anything in equatorial Africa. Yet they thrived. Their populations grew, diversified, adapted to local conditions through both cultural innovation and eventually some biological evolution. Lighter skin pigmentation evolved in northern latitudes, an adaptation to produce vitamin D in low light conditions. High-altitude populations in Tibet and the Andes developed physiological adaptations to thin air. Arctic populations evolved metabolic adaptations to high-fat diets. But these biological adaptations took thousands of generations. In the short term, what allowed humans to survive in such diverse environments was behavioral flexibility, the ability to observe, learn, and adapt their strategies. They learned which plants in each new region were edible, which animals could be hunted, where water could be found, how to build shelters appropriate to local materials and climate. They carried Africa with them, not just in their genes and their tools, but in their stories. Every migration probably involved origin myths, tales of where the people came from, ancestors who lived in warm lands of plenty. These stories, transmitted orally, evolved and changed over generations, but may have preserved deep memory of African origins for thousands of years before writing emerged to record them permanently. The archaeological record of this great expansion is written in stone tools, in cave paintings, in burial sites, in the bones of animals they hunted and the shells they discarded. Each site tells of arrival, of adaptation, of human ingenuity applied to new challenges. And underlying it all, enabling all of it, was the foundation laid in Africa over millions of years. They had been prepared by their homeland for exactly this. The environmental diversity of Africa had trained them to be flexible. The climate variability had selected for behavioral adaptability over biological specialization. The disease environment had given them robust immune systems. The predators had made them cautious and cooperative. The vastness had given them the population size to maintain cultural knowledge and genetic diversity. Now, spreading across the world, that preparation paid dividends. Each new environment was different from Africa, but the cognitive toolkit for dealing with novelty, for learning rapidly, for sharing knowledge, for cooperating in large groups, that toolkit transferred perfectly. The journey out of Africa was not a single march. but a slow wave of expansion, taking thousands of years, involving countless individual decisions by people who didn't know they were part of something larger. They simply moved, following game, seeking new territories, establishing camps that became settlements, having children who grew up knowing the new land as home and who might move a little further still. Within 50,000 years, humans had spread from Africa's cradle to encompass the globe. It was the greatest journey any species had ever undertaken, the colonization of a planet by a single lineage. And it began with a small group taking a step beyond the familiar, carrying with them fire and stone and words, carrying the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of African evolution, carrying the future of humanity into an unknown but conquerable world. And so we return, after our long journey through deep time, to this moment, to now, to you, listening in the quiet darkness, carrying within you the entire story we've just traced. 7 million years from those first tentative steps toward upright walking. 3 million years from the first stone struck against stone. 2 million years from fire captured and tended. Hundreds of thousands of years from the first words spoken around flames. And only 70,000 years from the moment a small group stood at Africa's edge and stepped into the unknown. The question we asked at the beginning, why did humans evolve in Africa, has an answer now. Not a simple answer, but a rich one, layered with geology and climate, biology and behavior, chance and necessity. Africa provided the only place on Earth where all the necessary conditions aligned. And from that perfect convergence emerged you and me and every human being who has ever lived or will ever live. If you've enjoyed this gentle journey through deep time, I invite you to like the video, subscribe to The Gentle Scientist, and share your thoughts in the comment below. It helps others find their way here too. For now, rest well. Good night.